The cold stone floor stung his cheek. The scent of incense and old parchment filled his nostrils. The murmur of voices pressed against his ears like a wall of water. Ethan Caldwell opened his eyes and didn't recognize a thing. Not the ceiling. Not the walls. Not even his own hands. His fingers were thinner. His skin was lighter. His body was lighter and younger. A flood of unfamiliar memories exploded in his head. Names, faces, lessons in stone halls, formulas in a language he didn't know but somehow understood. A mother with weary eyes. A father in a worn doublet bearing a coat of arms that no one had respected for a long time. The youngest son of an impoverished baron. 19 years old. He'd failed his final exam. And his name was the same. Ethan. Ethan Ray Caldwell. The coincidence hit him like a slap in the face. He blinked, propped himself up on his elbow. Dozens of people in uniform robes stood around him. The tall, columned hall stretched upward. Stained glass windows cast colorful patches of light onto the stone slabs. This was the examination hall of the Academy of the Nubo in the capital of Valengard. He knew that. Or rather, the other Ethan knew it, the one whose memory now lived in his head alongside his own. The examiner stood over him. A tall, gaunt old man in a black robe with a silver clasp shaped like a flame. Grand Master Renard Valancourt, head of the Academy, a man whose word determined destinies. He looked at Ethan the way one looks at a stain on the floor, without malice, without interest, simply noting that the stain was there and needed to be removed. The Magister picked up a fist-sized stone and held it out. His voice was even and bored. He said that the candidate must demonstrate his gift of the first flame. One last chance. Ethan stood up. His legs were shaking, not from fear, from the fact that his body felt foreign and his muscles obeyed with a half-second delay. He reached out for the stone. He closed his eyes. And he felt it. It was like pressing a button that hadn't existed before. Somewhere, an invisible switch clicked somewhere in his chest. The stone in the master's hand grew lighter. Just a little, maybe by a third. Valancourt winced. The stone slipped from his fingers and fell onto his foot. The old man hissed in pain. A ripple of laughter swept through the hall. Then silence. The master straightened up. His face turned to stone. He uttered a single word. Empty. The assistant stepped forward, holding a red-hot branding iron. The metal seared into Ethan's wrist. The pain was sharp and brief. A mark remained on his skin, a crossed-out circle. The symbol of the empty gift, the symbol of banishment. A murmur swept through the hall. His classmates looked on, some with pity, some with contempt, and some with relief that it hadn't happened to them. And Ethan stood there, staring at his new, scorched wrist. And he thought, not about the pain, not about the humiliation. He thought about the stone. He had made the stone lighter. He had changed its weight. Just by touching it, just by thinking. Control over weight. Control over how much pressure an object exerts on a surface. Control over effective gravity. In his past life, he had designed ultralight cargo airships, modular floating platforms for coastal cities. All his work had revolved around a single question: how to make the heavy light, how to lift into the air what wasn't meant to fly. And now he'd been given the ability to do just that. Literally. With his. No materials, no blueprints, no limitations of physics as he knew it. And these people called it an empty gift. He almost laughed. They led him out of the hall amid jeers. 2 guards in chainmail escorted him down a long corridor toward the exit. Heavy doors slammed shut behind him. Ahead lay the academy courtyard. A gray sky. A cold wind. A van with bars on the windows. They used these to transport criminals and exiles. 4 people were already sitting inside. A woman in her 40s with a vacant stare. A boy no older than 15 with a tear-stained face. An old man with trembling hands. And a burly man with a scar on his neck who sat in the corner, looking at no one. They all had the same brand on their wrists, a crossed-out circle. Ethan sat down on a wooden bench. The wagon jolted and set off. The wheels rumbled over the cobblestones of Valengard. Through the cracks in the walls, glimpses of the capital's streets flashed by. Stone houses with tiled roofs, merchant stalls, the temple of the first flame with its golden dome, the barracks of the royal army. All of that was now beyond their reach. He was heading to Kagra, a mountainous province at the edge of the world, a place where those whose gifts were deemed useless were sent. 300 years ago, the catastrophe of subsidence had occurred there. Entire layers of earth had collapsed into the abyss. All that remained were ruined mines, dead villages, poisonous fissures from which hot gas seeped, the perfect place to die slowly and quietly, so that no one would remember. Ethan closed his eyes and began to count. The stone in the Magister's hand weighed about 2 kilograms. He reduced the weight by a third. That meant he had removed about 700 grams of effective weight. This was his first attempt, without preparation, without understanding the mechanics, just instinct. If this is the limit, then yes, it's useless. But if this is only the beginning, if the scale will grow with practice, if it's possible to learn to control not only the magnitude but also the direction, then this isn't a worthless gift. Then it's the most powerful tool on this continent. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands, at the brand, at his slender fingers, at the lines on his palms. He didn't know why he'd ended up here. He didn't know the rules of this world. He didn't know what awaited him in Kagra. But he knew physics. He knew structural mechanics. He knew how to distribute loads. He knew how to calculate specific density. And he knew that gravity isn't just a force. It's the foundation. The journey took 6 days. 6 days of jostling along broken roads. 6 days of silence. The woman with the vacant stare never uttered a single word the entire way. The little boy cried for the first 2 days, then stopped. The old man coughed up blood into a rag. On the 3rd day, the man with the scar said his name was Borg, and that he was a blacksmith. His gift allowed him to heat metal with his hands, but only by 2 or 3 degrees. At the academy, they'd said it was useless. Ethan looked at him and asked if he knew what heat treatment was. Borg didn't know. Ethan explained that the ability to precisely control the temperature of metal, even by a few degrees, was the dream of every blacksmith on Earth. Borg didn't understand the word Earth. Ethan corrected himself and said he meant another place. Then he fell silent. He should have been more careful. On the 5th day, the road began to climb. The air grew colder and drier. The trees disappeared. Only rocks and low shrubs remained. On the 6th day, the wagon stopped. The guard opened the door and said they had arrived. "Get out, Kagra." Ethan got out and looked around. Gray mountains rose on all sides like walls. Between them, in a narrow valley, lay a village. 24 houses made of rough-hewn stone, shingle roofs, a muddy road, skinny goats, people in tattered clothes, children with wide eyes and ribs showing through their skin. The air smelled of gray, damp stone. In the distance, the entrances to old mines loomed dark. Some were blocked up. Steam rose from others. The guards unloaded the exiles and tossed a sack of provisions onto the ground, enough for a week. Then they turned the wagon around and drove off. The dust from the wheels hadn't yet settled when a woman emerged from the nearest house. She was about 24 years old. Her face was weather-beaten. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun. Her eyes were tired but steely. Her hands were calloused. A knife and a bunch of keys hung from her belt. She scanned the 5 new arrivals: the boy, the old man, the woman with the vacant stare, Borga, and Ethan. Then she said her name was Mira Khan, that she was the head of Kagra, that there wasn't much food, that there was plenty of work, that if they wanted to eat, they would have to work, that if they didn't want to work, they could go into the mountains and freeze to death, that the choice was theirs. Ethan stepped forward. He introduced himself. He asked what the main problem was right now. Mira looked at him with interest. Then she said that 3 days ago, the ceiling had collapsed in the eastern tunnel. A stone slab had blocked the entrance. There might be 2 people alive under it, or there might not be. The heavy-load beast had starved to death a week ago. 6 of the strongest men had tried to move the slab and failed. It weighed as much as 4 carts full of stone. Ethan asked if she could take him there right away. Mira looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. They walked along a rocky path for about 20 minutes. Mira walked quickly and didn't look back. 6 men were standing at the entrance to the tunnel. They were emaciated, their hands covered in scrapes. Ropes and crowbars lay nearby, they hadn't helped. In front of them was a slab. Huge. Gray. Half a meter thick. It blocked the entrance like a cork seals a bottle. Ethan stepped right up to it. He placed both palms on the cold surface of the stone. He closed his eyes. He felt the weight. It was like hearing a heavy, low note, thick and oppressive. 4 metric tons. Maybe a little more. He concentrated. He imagined that the weight was just a number, and that he could reduce that number. The note grew thinner, lighter, quieter. He reduced it further and further. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands trembled. The weight was falling. 4 metric tons. 3, 2, 1. 500 kilograms. 200. 100. 50. 40. He opened his eyes. He braced his shoulder against the slab and shifted it. 1. 4 metric tons of stone. He lifted them as easily as a cabinet door. 6 men watched him, motionless. One of them dropped his crowbar. Ethan held the slab with his arms outstretched. His voice was steady. He said he had about 10 minutes. Maybe less. The morning began before dawn, just as Mira had promised. She kicked the door of the barracks and said it was time to get up. Ethan was sleeping on a straw mattress in the communal house for the exiles. Borg was snoring nearby. The boy from the wagon was curled up in a corner. Ethan stood up. His body ached from the previous day. Every muscle reminded him of the 4 metric tons of stone. But his head was clear. He already knew what he would be doing today. Mira was waiting outside with a torch. Standing next to her was a man in his 50s with a hunched back and hands that had known the hammer. Mira said this was Gareth, that he was the senior miner, that he knew the mines better than anyone. Gareth looked at Ethan with suspicion. Just another kid from the capital, just another mouth to feed. They set off. Kagra had 7 tunnels. 3 were completely blocked. 2 were operational but barely. The supports were creaking. Water was seeping from the walls. 1 tunnel was flooded. The last one was considered cursed, and no one went there. Ethan inspected each one. He tapped on the walls. He felt the beams. He crouched down and looked at the floor. Gareth walked beside him, saying nothing. 3 hours later, they returned. Ethan asked Mira for something to write on. Mira gave him a piece of charred wood and a piece of coal. Ethan began to draw. Diagrams, load lines, stress points. Gareth stood nearby and watched. Then he said that the boy drew beautifully, but the drawings weren't very helpful. Ethan replied that these drawings explained why the 3rd tunnel had collapsed, and why the 2nd one would collapse in 2 weeks if nothing was done. The problem was simple. The supports were positioned incorrectly. The beams were holding up only the ceiling, but not the walls. But the pressure was coming from the sides. It was a classic mistake. On Earth, they'd stopped making that mistake 200 years ago. Ethan explained to Gareth that the supports needed to be arranged in a triangle. Not just vertical posts and a horizontal crossbar, but diagonal struts that distribute the lateral pressure. Gareth said no one had ever done it that way. Ethan replied that that was exactly why the tunnels kept collapsing. The day was spent arguing. Gareth didn't believe him. The miners didn't believe him. Mira listened but didn't intervene. By evening, Ethan proposed an experiment. He said they would install new supports in one short section of the tunnel, according to his plan. If they withstood the pressure in a week, he'd be right. If not, he'd shut up and haul rocks like everyone else. Gareth agreed, not because he believed it, but because he had nothing to lose. The next morning, Ethan Borg and 4 miners got to work. Ethan made the logs for the supports lighter. Every log that usually took 4 men to haul, he made as light as a stick. 1 man could carry it on his shoulder. The miners watched with their mouths agape. In a single day, they installed the supports that usually took a week to set up. Ethan checked every angle, every diagonal, every joint. Borg helped. His hands heated the metal brackets to exactly 3 degrees. That was enough to soften the metal slightly, so it would fit more tightly into the grooves. Ethan told him that his gift was perfect for precisely fitting the supports. Borg smiled for the first time in 6 days. By the end of the 3rd day, the section was ready. The supports stood perfectly straight. Triangular struts held up the walls. The ceiling didn't creak. Gareth tapped the beam with his fist. He listened. Then he tapped it again, and said nothing. But that evening, he sat down next to Ethan by the campfire and asked, "What else do you know?" Ethan knew a lot. The problem was that his knowledge had to be converted. He thought in meters, but here they measured in cubits. He thought in kilograms, but here they measured by eye. He thought in degrees, but here they spoke of hot and cold. The first thing he did was carve marks into a stick, exactly every 10 centimeters. 1 meter. He showed it to Mira. He said this would be their unit of length. Mira asked why. Ethan explained that if two people measured the same wall and one said 3 cubits and the other says 4, because their arms are different lengths, then the wall will turn out crooked. Mira looked at the stick, then at her own elbow, then back at the stick. She said it made sense, and she took the stick for herself. By the end of the first week in Kagri, several things had happened. Ethan's supports held up. Gareth checked them every day, and every day they stood as solid as a rock. The second tunnel stopped creaking after Ethan pointed out 3 spots where struts needed to be added. Borg started working in the blacksmith shop, which had been abandoned for 2 months. His gift turned out to be more useful than anyone had thought. He could heat the brackets and bring them to exactly the right temperature. Not more, not less. The same every time. The miners began coming to Ethan with questions. Not all of them, not right away. But they did, and then heat them precisely to the right temperature. Not more, not less. Exactly the same every time. The miners began coming to Ethan with questions. Not all of them, not right away. But they started coming, and then Noel arrived. She showed up on the 3rd day of the 2nd week, alone, on foot, wearing a tattered novice's robe from the Temple of the First Flame. Her white hair was tangled and dirty, a brand on her wrist, fear in her eyes. Mira was the first to see her. She led her to the campfire, gave her food. Noel ate greedily. Then she told her story. She had been a healer at the temple. Her gift was called gentle healing. She could heal wounds and illnesses, but only for those who trusted her. If a person feared her or didn't believe in her, the gift wouldn't work. The temple declared this heresy. True healing from the first flame must work on anyone, regardless of the patient's will. If the gift requires trust, then it comes from the darkness, not the light. She was put on trial, branded, sent to Kagra. On the way, she escaped from the wagon. She walked alone through the mountains for 4 days. Ethan listened. When she finished, he asked if she could demonstrate how her gift worked. Gareth had an old wound on his shoulder that hadn't healed in 3 months. Noel looked at Gareth. Gareth looked at her. He was a rough-and-tumble guy who believed in neither gods nor magic. But his shoulder hurt, and the girl looked as if she were about to collapse from exhaustion. He sat down next to her and said, "All right, give it a try." Noel placed her hands on his shoulder. She closed her eyes. A soft light flowed from her palms into Gareth's skin. He flinched, not from pain, but because the pain had gone away. For the first time in 3 months, he raised his arm above his shoulder. He looked at his palm. He clenched his fist, then he unclenched it. He turned to Noelle. She was sitting there, pale and trembling. The healing had taken a lot out of her. Gareth stood up. He left without a word. He returned a minute later with a bowl of hot porridge. He set it in front of her. "Eat," he said. Then he left. Ethan turned to Noelle. She was staring at the bowl of porridge as if she'd been given a crown. He told her that her gift wasn't a defect, that it was a system built into the very fabric of magic itself. She couldn't heal by force. She could only heal with consent. That meant her gift couldn't be used as a weapon. It couldn't be a tool of coercion. It could only be a doctor. A real one. Noelle listened. Her lips trembled. She asked how he knew that. Ethan replied that where he came from, doctors take an oath. And the first rule of that oath is, do no harm. Her gift already contains that oath within it. Noelle lowered her head. Her shoulders shook. She cried silently. Ethan didn't try to comfort her. He just sat beside her. A minute later, she raised her head and wiped her eyes. She asked what she should do. Ethan said she needed to heal people, that everyone in Kagra was sick, that she would have plenty of work, and that he needed her help, because he was going to rebuild these mines and people would get injured. He needed a doctor they trusted. Noelle nodded. She stayed. The plow started working on the 4th day of the 3rd week. Ethan had spent the entire night before that engraving anchor patterns on the iron plowshare. It was a new discovery. If he simply touched an object, the effect lasted only as long as he kept his hand on it. As soon as he let go, the weight returned to normal. But if he carved a specific pattern on the surface and traced it with his finger while channeling the dar, the effect would be locked in. Not forever, just for a few hours, or sometimes half a day. It depended on the precision of the pattern and the size of the object. He called these patterns anchors. The term itself came from a past life. In engineering, an anchor is a point of attachment, a point on which the entire structure rests. Here, the anchor worked the same way, a point through which his gift remained attached to the object without constant contact. The plow with 3 anchors weighed as little as an empty basket. A horse nicknamed Red pulled it all by herself, without straining, almost playfully. On the first day, they plowed a field that usually took a week to plow. Mira stood at the edge of the field and watched. The wind ruffled her hair. Her face was inscrutable. But Ethan noticed how she clenched her fists. Not out of anger, out of something else. Maybe it was hope. A hope she didn't allow herself to feel. That evening, she came to him. She said he was right. That 1 horse plowed as well as 4. That if they planted now, there would be a harvest by fall. That maybe this winter, no one would die of hunger. Then she paused and said she needed more plows. Ethan replied that he could make 2 anchors a day, maybe 3 if he didn't sleep. But anchors weren't just for plows. They were needed for carts, for hoists, for beams, for everything heavy. He needed apprentices, people who could engrave under his guidance. He would channel the gift, and they would carve the patterns. Mira asked how many people. Ethan said 3 to start with, the most meticulous ones, with steady hands. Mira brought Cayman to him, a quiet 22-year-old with a gift that allowed him to see cracks in stone. Absolutely useless on the battlefield. Absolutely perfect for finding defects in materials. The second was Tariq, a former potter with a gift that made clay a little more malleable in his hands. Again, useless in battle. Perfect for precise engraving. The third was a girl. She was 16. Her name was Kana Ray, an orphan. Her parents had died in a cave-in 2 years ago. After that, she hadn't spoken for half a year. Now she spoke very little. She walked quietly. She always carried a notebook made of pieces of leather sewn together. She wrote down everything she saw. Every word. Every number. Every drawing on the wall. Her gift was called precise memory. She remembered everything. Word for word. Picture by picture. At the academy, they said it was only useful for clerks. Ethan looked at her notebook. He flipped through it. He saw his own drawings of the fortifications, copied with perfect precision. Every line, every number, every angle. He looked at Hannah. She stood before him, waiting. Small, thin, with big dark eyes. Ethan told her that she was now their archive. That she would memorize and record everything they built. Every project, every calculation, every mistake and every decision. That when he was gone, she would tell the story of how it all happened. That this was very important work. More important than any sword. Hannah stared at him without blinking. Then the corners of her lips twitched. It was the first smile anyone had seen on her face in 2 years. The training began. Ethan demonstrated the anchor patterns. Cayman checked the material for cracks before engraving. Tariq carved the lines with a jeweler's precision. Hannah recorded every step. Every evening, Ethan went over the finished anchors and imbued them with the gift. The pattern would glow with a dim light, and the object would become lighter. After a week, they had 5 lightened plows, 3 lightened carts, and 1 mine hoist that could lift ore to the surface with just 2 people instead of 10. The settlement was changing. People who, a month ago, had been mere shadows were beginning to stand up straight. Hunger was receding. The fields were sown. The mines were safer. Noelle treated those who came to her with trust, and more people came. Gareth stopped calling Ethan a boy. He started calling him by his name. It was a victory, but Ethan was thinking ahead. In the evenings, he would sit on a rock overlooking the settlement and gaze at the mountains, and he was thinking it through. Kagra's problem wasn't the mines. It wasn't the hunger. The problem was that the ground beneath them kept sinking. He saw the cracks. He saw how the walls of the houses were warping by a millimeter every week. He saw how the water in the well stood slightly lower than it had been a week ago. This process was slow. It took years, decades, but it was happening. And sooner or later, Kagra would collapse just as it had 300 years ago, giving with everyone he was trying to save. He needed a solution, not a temporary one, not a band-aid solution, but a real engineering solution. And it was already taking shape in his mind. Insane. Impossible. The only right one. If he could make objects lighter, if he could anchor the effect, if the anchors could be scaled up, then why couldn't he lighten an entire building, an entire block, an entire village, to the point where it would stop pressing down on the ground, to the point where it would break free from it? He thought about this every evening, and every evening the idea seemed crazier, and every evening he realized it was the only one that made sense. But that was a long way off. Right now he had to solve the most immediate problem. The third month. The first winter in the mountains was approaching. He had to insulate the houses. He needed to stock up on food. He needed to fix the water pump, which froze every winter and left the village without water for 3 months. Ethan examined the water pump. It was an old structure made of wood and stone. A pipe ran from a mountain stream to the village. In winter, the water in the pipe would freeze, and the pipe would burst. Every spring, the pipe was repaired. Every winter, it burst again. The solution lay in the ground. Hot gases seeping from the cracks, those very same poisonous fumes that everyone feared. Ethan approached the nearest crack. Hot air was rising. It felt like 60 degrees to the touch, maybe 70. Toxic, but hot. If he ran the pipe next to the crack but not through it, if he lined the pipe with stone that would heat up from its proximity to the gases, then the water in the pipe wouldn't freeze. Geothermal heating, the simplest principle. It had been used on Earth for thousands of years. Here, no one had thought of it before because the fissures were considered a curse rather than a resource. Ethan explained the idea to Gareth. Gareth said he was crazy, that cracks kill, that 3 miners had died from gas last year. Ethan agreed that gas was dangerous. But the pipe wouldn't pass through the gas. It would run alongside it, inside a stone casing. The gas wouldn't touch the water, only the heat would. Gareth thought about it for 2 days. Then he said it might work. They spent 3 weeks building the system. Borg forged the pipes, K-Min checked the stone for cracks. Tariq cut the joints with jeweler's precision. Ethan lightened the stone blocks for the lining. Noel kept medical supplies on hand in case of gas poisoning. Mira coordinated the work. Hannah recorded everything. When the first water flowed through the new pipe on the first frosty day, the village fell silent. The water was warm. Not hot, but warm. In winter, in the mountains, where everyone usually froze solid. The old man from the van, the one who'd been coughing up blood, held his palms under the stream. Warm water ran over his fingers. He stood there for a minute, too, without moving. Then he turned and went back into his house. Mira said his name was Dorn, that he doesn't talk, that he has a gift that lets him sense the direction of the wind. A completely useless gift, Ethan thought. Then he said that when they build windmills, this gift will be the most valuable one in the village. Mira looked at him. She asked what a windmill was. Ethan smiled for the first time in 3 weeks in Kagra. He said he'd explain tomorrow. Today they had hot water. That was reason enough to just sit down and relax. Mira sat down next to him on a rock. They watched in silence as the people of Kagra, one by one, approached the pipe and touched the hot water. Some laughed. Some stood in silence. One little boy was splashing around and squealing with delight. Mira said quietly that in the 7 years she'd been running this village, she'd never once seen people laugh in the winter. Ethan didn't reply. He just sat there beside her. Winter had hit hard. Snow had buried the mountain packs overnight. The temperature had dropped so low that breath froze in the air and fell as crystals. But Kagra held on. Warm water flowed. There was enough food. The mines were operating. The supports held firm. People weren't dying. For the first time in years, no one died during the first month of winter. Ethan worked non-stop. He was lightening the load on the walls of the houses so that a second layer of stone could be added for insulation. One man lifted a block that usually took 4 to carry. The houses were getting warmer. Borg forged stove doors and hinges. K-Min checked the walls for cracks before insulating them. Tariq carved anchors into the floor beams. Hana kept records. Noel treated frostbite and colds. Her gift was working with increasing confidence. The people of Kagra began to trust her, and that trust was the fuel for her magic. The more they trusted her, the more powerfully she could heal. Mira managed everything. She distributed food. She assigned shifts. She settled disputes. She'd been doing this for 7 years, and she did it well. But Ethan could see that she was growing weary. Not physically. Deeper than that. She was carrying the entire village on her shoulders, and no one was carrying her. One night he couldn't sleep. He stepped out of the barracks. He saw a light in Mira's house. He walked over. The door was ajar. Mira was sitting at the table. Lists lay before her. Food supplies, the number of sick people, the number of healthy people, the number of children. The number of elderly people. She was counting, recounting. Her lips were moving, her eyes were red. Ethan knocked. She flinched. She quickly wiped her face with her sleeve. She said everything was fine. Ethan came in. He sat down across from her. He said he needed her help with the calculations for a new project. It was a lie. He didn't need her help. He just wanted her to stop sitting alone. They talked until dawn. Not about the project, about the settlement, about the people, about how she became the village head at 17 when her father died in the mine and there was no one else but her. About how 12 people died that first winter, and she remembers every name. About how new outcasts arrive every year, and every year she gives them work and a roof over their heads. And every year someone still doesn't make it to spring. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened. As morning approached, Mira fell silent. She looked at him. She said she hadn't talked to anyone like that in a long time. Ethan nodded. He said he'd show her something tomorrow. In the morning, he led her outside the settlement, to the distant fissure from which the hottest gas flowed. There, among the rocks, he had built a small structure over the previous 3 days. A stone bath. 2 meters by 1.5, waist deep. A pipe from the hot spring filled it with warm water. Walls made of lightweight stone sheltered it from the wind. A shingled roof protected it from the snow. A small bathhouse. Not for the village, for her. Mira stood and watched, for a long time. Then she asked what it was. Ethan said it was a place where she could sit in warm water after a long day. That it wasn't for everyone, just for her. That she had taken care of everyone in this village for 7 years, and not a single person had taken care of her. That it wasn't right, and that he was fixing it. Mira stood there. The wind ruffled her hair. Snow fell on her shoulders. She didn't move for 10 seconds. 20. Then she lowered her head. Her shoulders shook. She was crying. For the first time in 7 years. Silently. Covering her mouth with her hand. Like someone who had forgotten how to cry and now didn't know how to do it. Ethan stood beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He gave her space. A minute later, she straightened up. She wiped her face. Her eyes were red but dry. Her voice was steady. She said thank you. Then she turned and walked back to the village. To manage. To keep track. To take care of everyone. But that evening, Ethan noticed that the light in her house went out earlier than usual. And that in the morning, she looked a little less tired. Winter was setting in. The days were short. The work was hard. But Kagra was alive. Ethan used the winter months to think a lot. He studied his gift as an engineer, methodically, systematically. Every day he set up experiments. He took stones of various sizes. He made them lighter. He timed the process. He measured the degree of weight reduction. Kana recorded all the results. After a month, he had a table. Pure statistics. Maximum weight reduction. 97% of the original weight. A 1 metric ton stone became 30 kilograms. This wasn't 30% as they'd calculated at the academy. It was on an entirely different scale. Maximum weight increase. Roughly 3 times the original weight. A 100-kilogram stone became 300 kilograms, useful for defense, for castles, for doors that are impossible to break down. The direction of the vector. That was the most important discovery. He could change not only the magnitude of the weight, but also its direction. A stone could fall to the side, or upward, slowly, hesitantly, but upward. When he first made the stone rise above the table, Khan dropped her notebook. She picked it up, jotted it down, dropped it again. Ethan understood what this meant. If he could direct the gravitational vector upward, then he could make an object levitate. Not fly, not float freely, but hang in the air. If the correct anchors were applied to it and if the vector was precisely calibrated. This was the foundation for everything he had in mind. He needed calculations. Real calculations. Not on a blackboard with a piece of charcoal. On paper, with formulas, with tables. The problem was that there was no one in Kagri who could do math at that level. Gareth knew the mines. Mira knew people. Borg knew metal. K-Min saw cracks. Tariq cut with precision. Hana remembered everything. But none of them could solve a differential equation. No one knew what an integral was. No one could calculate the load distribution across a complex, three-dimensional structure. Ethan could. But he needed someone who could verify his calculations. Someone who could debate him on his level. Someone who could say, "You're wrong right here." Without that, any structure will collapse sooner or later. Because one engineer is a vulnerability. Two engineers are a system. The answer came at the end of winter, with a caravan. Once every 2 months, a caravan arrived from Valengard carrying new exiles. 10 or 20 people. Branded, broken, hungry. Mira took in everyone. She gave them food. She gave them shelter. She gave them work. This time there were 15 people. Among them was an old man of about 60 with a white beard and wild eyes, and a girl of about 18 beside him. The old man carried a bundle of rolled-up parchments on his back. The girl carried a wooden box of tools. Mira told Ethan that the old man's name was Arthur Wenton, a former engineer from the province of Talver. His gift allowed him to sense stress in structures, where a beam was overloaded, where a wall would crack. 20 years ago, he presented a design for a flying platform to the academy. They laughed at him, declared him mad, stripped him of his title, branded him. They sent him to Kagra, but he never made it there. He lived in the foothills for 20 years. He drew blueprints. He calculated. He went mad from the fact that no one listened to him. And right beside him, his daughter was growing up. Lyra Wenton, 18 years old. She grew up surrounded by blueprints and calculation tables. Her gift was similar to her father's, but more precise. She sensed not just tension, but its numerical value. She could say that this beam would hold 412 kilograms and be no more than 5 off. The academy said it was useless. Who needs a girl who senses numbers? Ethan spread out Arthur Wenton's blueprints right on the frozen ground. He knelt in the snow and read. Lyra stood nearby, shifting from foot to foot. Arthur sat on a rock and stared into space. 20 years of madness had left their mark. He was both here and not here at the same time. Ethan read. The calculations were rough. The materials were wrong. The scale was too large. But the foundation was right. A distributed system of relief points. A platform made of stone and wood. Anchors at the nodes of the grid. A balance of ascending and descending vectors. 20 years ago, Arthur Wenton, without any knowledge of Earth's physics, had arrived at the same conclusions that any aerospace engineer would have reached. Intuitively. By feel. Through his gift. Ethan raised his head. He looked at Arthur. The old man was staring at him with cloudy eyes. Ethan said 3 sentences to him. Master Wenton, your calculations are correct. Every single one. You were simply 300 years ahead of your time. Arthur blinked. The cloudiness in his eyes wavered. He leaned forward. He looked at his drawings. Then at Ethan. Then back at the drawings. His lips trembled. He tried to say something but couldn't. Lyra grabbed Ethan by the sleeve. Her eyes were shining. She spoke quickly and incoherently. She asked if it was true. If the calculations were correct. if her father really wasn't crazy. Ethan replied that her father was a genius, that his project needed refinement, but the principal was absolutely correct, and that he needed her help. He needed a mathematician, someone who could calculate as well as he could, or better. He asked if she knew how to solve equations. Lyra replied that she didn't know what equations were, but if he showed her, she'd learn. Ethan looked at her. 18 years old, thin. Her hair was tousled, her fingers were stained with ink, her eyes were ablaze. He said he'd give her her first project. Spring had come, and Kagra came to life. Snow melted from the mountains in muddy streams. The cracks gushed more fiercely. The ground was getting soggy. But the village stood. All the houses had survived the winter. All the people had survived the winter. For the first time. Mira announced this at a town meeting, and her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Ethan didn't wait. Spring is the construction season. 3 months until the heat. 4 until fall. 6 until the next winter. Every day counted. He assembled a team. Mira, Lyra, Borg, Gareth, Cayman, Tariq, Hannah, Noel. 9 people. He laid out the blueprints in front of them, his own and Venton's. He explained the plan. He was going to build a bridge. Across the gorge east of the village. On the other side of the gorge lay 2 abandoned mine shafts rich in ore. They couldn't be reached because the bridge had collapsed 15 years ago and the gorge was 300 meters deep. Building a bridge the usual way would take 2 years. Ethan was going to do it in 2 days. Gareth said it was impossible. Mira said it was madness. Lyra raised her hand and said the calculations added up. Ethan explained. The bridge would consist of lightweight stone blocks. Each block, which normally weighed a metric ton, would be reduced to 30 kilograms. A single person could carry it as easily as a sack of flour. The blocks would be laid on temporary supports made of lightweight wood. Once all the blocks were in place, Ethan would attach permanent anchors to each one. The anchors won't just make the blocks lighter, they'll hold them in the right position. A directed vector. Each block will pull upward just a little bit, exactly enough to offset its own weight and the weight of whatever's walking across it. A bridge without supports. Hanging in the air. No, not suspended, standing on its own gravity. Gareth looked at the blueprints, then at Ethan, then back at the blueprints. He said that if the kid killed them all, he'd come after him from the afterlife. Ethan replied that he accepted the terms. Work began the next morning. The first day was spent on preparation, cutting stone blocks. Borg cut the stone with heated chisels. Cayman inspected each block for internal cracks. He discarded any that had defects. Of the 40 blocks cut, 12 were discarded. Ethan explained that in a structure that would hang over a 300-meter chasm, there could be no defective elements. Not a single one. Gareth grumbled that the kid was right, and that it infuriated him. Tariq engraved anchors on the blocks under Lyra's guidance. Lyra stood next to the slate and marked the spots. Here, over here, deeper, 3 millimeters to the left. Tariq cursed under his breath but kept working. His hands didn't tremble. Every cut was smooth and precise. Hannah walked among them and recorded everything. The block number, the anchor coordinates, the depth of the cut, the start time, and the end time. Noelle sat off to the side with a set of bandages and ointments. She waited. Mira assigned tasks. Who would haul the blocks? Who would hold the supports? Who would act as a belayer? She did this with practiced ease, quickly, without a word. By the evening of the first day, all the blocks were ready, 28 of them, each with anchors waiting to be activated. Ethan walked down the row. He touched each block. He imbued them with the gift. Block by block, the engraved lines glowed dimly. The blocks became light. A single person could lift each one onto their shoulder. Lyra calculated the total weight. She checked the balance. She reported. The total weight of the structure in its lightweight state was 402 kilograms. In its normal state, it was 13.5 metric tons. Ethan nodded. Fine. A 7-fold safety margin. That's enough. The morning of the second day. The gorge. Ethan stood at the edge and looked down. 300 meters of empty space. Fog at the bottom. The wind whistled through the rocks. Mira stood nearby. She was looking in the same direction. She said that if he fell, she wouldn't catch him. Ethan replied that he wasn't planning on falling. The first block. 4 men carried it to the edge. Ethan lifted it by himself. He placed it on the edge of the cliff. Half the block hung over the abyss. Ethan closed his eyes. He activated the directional anchor. The vector pointed upward. The block froze in place. It didn't fall. It didn't rise. It just hung there. Ethan gently pushed it forward. The block slid into the void and came to a stop. Hovering over the 300-meter chasm, it looked as if it were resting on an invisible table. Silence. Absolute silence. 20 people stood at the edge of the gorge, watching the stone block hang in the air. Gareth uttered the one word that Ethan hadn't asked Hannah to write down. Then the work began. Block by block. Ethan positioned each one. He checked its alignment. He adjusted the angle. Lyra stood with a whiteboard and shouted corrections to him. Slightly to the left, 3 degrees downward along the leading edge. Wind load compensation for Block 14. They worked like 2 engineers from the same firm, as if they'd been doing this for years. By noon, the bridge had reached the middle of the gorge. 14 blocks hung in the air. A smooth 2-meter wide path. Over the abyss, without a single support. Ethan stepped onto the bridge. Alone. He walked slowly, checking each block with his foot. He could feel the anchors responding to the added weight. The structure sagged slightly by 2 centimeters. Lyra called out the numbers. The sag was within the calculated limits. Ethan nodded and continued on. By the end of the day, the bridge was ready. 28 blocks, 60 meters, over a 300-meter chasm. In 2 days. A bridge that usually took 2 years to build. Gareth was the first to cross it, slowly, grasping at thin air because there were no railings yet. He reached the other side. He stood there for a moment. He stamped his foot on the stone. He turned around and shouted that the bridge was standing, that he was a damn madman, but the bridge was standing. The people of Kagra stood at the edge and watched. Some were crying. Not out of fear, out of something else. Those tunnels on the other side of the gorge had been inaccessible for 15 years. For 15 years, the ore that could have fed the village had lain 60 meters across the chasm. And no one could reach it. Now they could. Ethan sat on the edge of the gorge. His legs dangled down. He was exhausted. 2 days of non-stop work with the anchors had worn him out to the point where his hands were shaking like an old man's. Noelle came over and sat down beside him. She placed her hands on his shoulders. Warm light seeped through the fabric of his shirt into his muscles. The fatigue receded. It didn't disappear, but it receded. He turned toward her. She quickly withdrew her hands. She looked away. She said she was just checking to see if he had any strains. Ethan thanked her. Noelle nodded and walked away, at a brisk pace. Too brisk for a simple check. Mira saw it. She didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. 3 days after the bridge was built, the first strangers arrived at the village. Not outcasts from yet another caravan, refugees. A family of 4. A husband, a wife, and 2 children. Ordinary folk from the province of Talver. They were fleeing the tax collectors. The husband had a gift. He could make fabric slightly stronger just by touching it. The fabric wouldn't tear as easily. It wouldn't wear out. The academy called it a worthless gift, a stigma. But instead of the mountain mines, he fled with his family to the foothills. He went into hiding. For 2 years. Then he heard rumors. There's a place in the Kagra Mountains where exiles aren't killed, where they're fed, where the mines are working, where they built a bridge in 2 days. He came to check it out. Mira took them in. She gave them a home. She gave them food. Ethan spoke with her husband. His name was Ren. Ethan asked exactly how his gift worked. Ren demonstrated. He took a piece of fabric. He ran his fingers over it. The fabric became stiffer, stronger, like thin leather. Ethan watched. He thought. Then he asked Ren to run his hand over a thin piece of canvas stretched across a frame. Ren did so. The canvas became stiff as a board, light as paper, strong as leather. Ethan picked up the frame and tried to bend it. It wouldn't bend. He tried to tear the canvas. It wouldn't tear. He looked at Ren. He said he knew what Ren's gift was for. Ren asked what for. Ethan answered with one word: sales. Ren didn't understand. Ethan explained. If they were going to build a platform that rises into the air, that platform would need walls, roofs, partitions. Stone is too heavy, wood is too fragile. But fabric reinforced by Ren's gift and made lighter by Ethan's anchors is the ideal building material. Lightweight, durable, flexible. Just like the composite panels Ethan had designed in his past life for airships. Ren stood there listening. The hands that had spent 20 years mending shirts and patching tents suddenly became the hands of an engineer. He didn't know it yet, but Ethan did. By the end of the 5th month in Kagra, the population had grown to 120 people. They arrived in groups of 1 or 2, or as families. Some came with the caravans, others came on their own. Rumors spread through the provinces like ripples on water. There's a place in the mountains, where empty gifts aren't empty, where everyone is needed. Ethan didn't call anyone. They came on their own. And he greeted everyone who arrived with a single question. What can you do? Not what gift you have. What can you do? Because a gift is just a tool, and skill is what you do with that tool. There are no useless skills. There are only skills for which the right task hasn't been found yet. He repeated this to everyone, and every time, it was true. Mira stood nearby and watched as he spoke with yet another broken person. How he found in each one something no one else had seen. How he gave each person not charity but work. Not pity but respect. She watched and thought that this strange boy with an empty brand on his wrist was doing what all of Valengard, with its academy, its temple, and army had failed to do in 300 years. He was building a world in which everyone was needed, and Lyra sat in the corner of the workshop and calculated. Before her lay the design for the first platform, 40 meters in diameter, 240 anchors, each at its own point, each with a precise vector. She calculated the load distribution and double-checked every number, because those numbers determined whether the platform would fly or collapse. And when she looked up from the board and saw Ethan leaning over the blueprint next to her, she quickly looked away, because her cheeks would start to burn. And she didn't know what to do about it. Hana wrote everything down, quietly, carefully. Every one of Lyra's formulas, every one of Ethan's drawings, every one of Mira's orders, every one of Noel's treatments, every one of Borg's nails. She was the archive, the living memory of everything that happened here. And for the first time in her life, it mattered. For the first time in her life, her gift was needed. For the first time, she wasn't called a clerk, she was called an archivist, and that word like a title. The 6th month began with trouble. A sentry on the southern trail came running in the morning and said there were horsemen down in the valley, 20 of them, in the uniform of the Royal Guard, the banner of Valengard. Mira turned pale. Ethan did not. He had been expecting this. Sooner or later, the capital was bound to take notice. 120 people in the mountains were not just a handful of exiles. It was a settlement. And a settlement without a royal charter was a rebellion. Ethan called a council. Mira, Gareth, Borg, Lyra. They sat around a table in the workshop and looked at one another. Mira said they had to leave, deep into the mountains, to hide. Gareth said they had to fight. They had pickaxes and hammers. Borg said they didn't stand a chance against 20 guards with the gifts of destruction. Lyra remained silent, calculating something on the board. Ethan raised his hand. He said they shouldn't run or fight. The punitive squad was coming along the southern trail, the only road to Kagra. The trail runs along the edge of the gorge. It's narrow, rocky, 300 meters of empty space below it. Ethan got up in the middle of the night. He went out alone. He made his way to the trail. He placed his hands on the rock, and he began to work. For 6 hours, until dawn. He placed anchors in the bedrock beneath the trail, not on the surface, but deeper, where the rock held up the entire structure. The anchors were special, not permanent. They were on standby. They would only work when Ethan activated them. And then the rock beneath the trail, along a 50-meter stretch, would become as light as foam, and it would collapse downward, along with everything standing on it. He returned to the village before dawn. He lay down. He closed his eyes. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. Noel came over without a word. She placed her palms on his shoulders. A warm light eased the spasms from his muscles. Ethan thanked her. She nodded and left. In the morning, the squad began their ascent up the trail. Ethan stood on a cliff above and watched. 20 horsemen, heavy cavalry, an officer in the lead with the gift of fire. A flame danced in the palm of his hand. They rode with confidence. Why fear a handful of branded miners? Ethan waited. When the last rider entered the prepared area, Ethan activated the anchors. Remotely. For the first time in his life, he didn't touch the stone. The stone was 300 meters away from him. But the anchors were his engraving, his gift, and they obeyed. The rock beneath the trail became weightless. 50 meters of the trail sagged and crumbled downward. The horses neighed. The riders screamed. But the trail didn't collapse instantly. Ethan didn't want that. He didn't want to kill. He wanted them to leave. The trail sank slowly, like melting snow. The riders had time. They turned around. They drove their horses back. They jumped off. They ran. Within 3 minutes, all 20 had made it to solid ground. And the trail behind them vanished into a cloud of dust and the roar of falling rocks. A 50-meter gap now lay between Kagra and the valley. An abyss. No bridge, no road, no way to cross. The officer stood at the edge and looked upward. The flame in his palm flickered. He didn't understand what had happened. An earthquake, a landslide, a curse. He didn't know. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and led the squad down, into the valley, to Valengard, to report. Mira stood next to Ethan and watched as the dust settled over the chasm. She asked, "Could you have brought down the trail beneath them?" Ethan nodded. She asked, "Why didn't you?" Ethan replied that he didn't need dead bodies. He needed a wall. Mira looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was a strange man, and that she was glad he was on their side. That evening, Ethan gathered the village. All 120 people stood in the square in front of the workshop. Children in their mother's arms, old people on rocks, miners with their pickaxes, everyone. Ethan stood on a crate. Not because he liked the attention, because otherwise, no one could see him. He said that the punitive squad had left, that the trail had been destroyed, that they were safe. For now. But Valengard would send more of them, stronger ones. And then the destroyed trail wouldn't help. He said that now they were rebels, whether they wanted to be or not. The kingdom does not forgive. There is no turning back. He fell silent. The people watched. They waited. He said he didn't know how to be a king, didn't know how to wage war, didn't know how to command an army. But he knows how to build a house that won't collapse. And he knows how to build a city that no one can take by storm. Because this city won't stand on the ground. Silence. Then whispers. Then a murmur. Mira raised her hand. The murmur died down. She said that if anyone wanted to leave, they could go. Through the northern pass. No one is stopping them. But if anyone wants to stay, let them stay and work. Because there will be plenty of work. No one left. Not a single person. For the next 3 months, Kagra built. Ethan worked 18 hours a day. Mira made him sleep for at least 6. He wouldn't listen. Then Noel refused to treat his exhaustion until he started sleeping. It worked. He began sleeping 7 hours. Lyra worked alongside him, every day, from morning until night. Calculations, formulas, tables. She mastered mathematics with the eagerness of someone who had been starving their whole life and saw food for the first time. In 2 months, she went from arithmetic to trigonometry, Ethan explained. She grasped it. Sometimes she got ahead of his explanations. She would finish his sentences. She would see the solutions before he even formulated the problem. Arthur Wenton was slowly coming to his senses. Not completely. 20 years of madness aren't erased in a matter of months. But he began to speak. He began to draw. He began to walk around the construction site, touching the beams and muttering numbers. His gift for sensing stress in structures proved indispensable. He'd walk past a wall and say, "It'll crack right here in a week." And he'd be right, every single time. Borg forged anchor plates, flat engraved metal discs. Ethan discovered that anchors held twice as long in metal as they did in stone. Metal conducted his gift better. Cayman inspected every detail. Turek engraved them. Hana took notes. Ren reinforced the fabric for the walls and partitions. His wife sewed. Their children helped stretch the canvases onto the frames. By the 9th month, the first platform was ready. 40 meters in diameter, round. A stone base on a steel frame. 240 anchors at the grid nodes. Each anchor calibrated by Lyra to the millimeter. Each checked by Arthur for tension. Each was engraved by Tarek. Each was marked by Hanoi. On the platform stood a grain silo, a blacksmith shop, a water pump connected to the geothermal heating system, a workshop, 4 residential buildings made of reinforced fabric on a lightweight frame. Everything was lightweight. Everything was connected into a single system of anchors. Ethan stood in the center of the platform. All the residents of Kagra stood around him, 150 people. They had come to watch. Mira stood nearby. Lyra held a chalkboard. Noel carried a medical bag. Borg stood with his arms crossed over his chest. Gareth had a look on his face that said if this thing didn't take off, he'd personally drown Ethan in a well. Ethan placed his hands on the central anchor, a large steel disc mounted in the stone base, the heart of the entire system. He closed his eyes and pulled. 240 anchors responded like 240 strings, each on its own note. Ethan heard them, felt them. He balanced the load. A little more on the northern edge, a little less on the southern, compensating for the wind, adjusting for uneven weight distribution. The barn is heavier than the workshop. The center of gravity shifted 2 meters to the south. Compensate. The first jolt, light, like a sigh. The platform wavered. The stones beneath it creaked. Dust rained down from the edges. People recoiled. Second jolt, stronger. The platform lifted slightly on one side. A 2-degree list. Lyra shouted the correction. Ethan adjusted. The list disappeared. A third jolt. The platform broke free from the ground, first by a centimeter, then by 10, then by a meter. Silence. Absolute silence. 150 people stood on a stone disc suspended in the air 1 meter above the ground. No one was breathing. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked down. There was a meter of empty space between the platform and the ground. He increased the thrust. 2 meters. 5. 10. 20. The platform rose slowly and smoothly, like an elevator. 30 meters. 40. 50. Ethan stopped the ascent. 50 meters above the ground. The platform hovered. Steady. Stable. No roll, no sway. The wind whistled along the edges. The clouds were closer. The mountains were lower. Gareth walked to the edge and looked down. Then he turned to Ethan. His face was pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said one word. It's flying. Someone laughed. Then someone else. Then a child screamed with delight, and the village erupted. People were shouting, hugging each other, crying, stomping their feet on the stone floor that hung in the air. Arthur went and stood at the edge of the platform and looked down. Tears streamed down his face into his white beard. He turned to Lyra. His voice trembled. He told her they were flying, that they were flying after all. Lyra hugged her father. She pressed her face against his chest. Her shoulders shook. Ethan stood in the center. His hands were on the anchor. Sweat was streaming down his face. His body was screaming with tension. 240 anchors were draining his strength like 240 leeches. He could hold on. He could, but not forever. He carefully lowered the platform. 50 meters. 40. 30. 20. 10. He set the platform back down. Gently. Precisely. Right where it had risen from. He took his hands off the anchor and sat down on a rock because his legs couldn't hold him up. Noel was by his side a second later. A warm light washed over his body. He closed his eyes and exhaled. It works. The first platform works. It was a prototype, a proof of concept. He'd lifted a 40-meter wide disc with people and buildings on it 50 meters into the air and set it back down. No accidents. No casualties. No mistakes. Now it was time to scale up. After testing the first platform, Ethan slept for 20 hours. Noel kept watch nearby. Mira had forbidden anyone from waking him. When he opened his eyes, the morning sun was shining through the window. Hana was sitting on a chair nearby, a notebook on her lap. She was waiting. Ethan sat up. His head was buzzing. His body felt like it was made of cotton, but his thoughts were clear. He asked Hana how long he had slept. She answered precisely, 20 hours and 42 minutes. He nodded. He stood up. He went outside. Kagra was buzzing like a beehive. People were working, carrying stones, sawing wood, forging metal. The energy of the trial hadn't faded. It had seeped into the people like water into dry earth. They had seen the platform rise. They stood on it as it hung over the abyss. And now they believed. Ethan found Mira in her home. She was sitting at a table with new lists. The population was growing. Every week, new people arrived. Refugees, outcasts, just the hungry. Rumors of the flying platforms spread through the provinces like wildfire. Mira said there were already 200 of them, that there was still enough food, that the mines were yielding ore, that the bridge was working, but that 200 wasn't the same as 120, and that there would soon be 300. Ethan nodded. He said it was time to start building for real. Not just one platform, an entire district. Airholm. The word came to him on its own. Air from an ancient people whose cities once flew. Home from an old word meaning a safe place, a flying refuge. Mira mulled over the word. She said it sounded pretty good. Then she asked how he planned to build an entire district in the air if a single platform had kept him asleep for 20 hours. Ethan replied that that was precisely the problem. A single platform required his constant presence for the initial liftoff. He would activate the 240 anchors himself, but after that, the anchors would operate autonomously. They support the weight without his involvement. He just needs to configure the system and launch it. Once launched, the platform hovers on its own. That means he can build platform after platform, one after another. Connect them. Finish building them. Each new platform is a new district, new homes, new workshops, new farms. The problem is scale. 240 anchors per platform. 10 platforms means 2,400 anchors. Each one needs to be cut, checked, and activated. Tarek can't handle it alone. He needed more engravers, more material, more time. Lyra had already done the math. She came to see him 2 days later with a thick notebook full of calculations. She sat down next to him, talking quickly as always, her hands flying over the pages. She'd found a way to reduce the number of anchors, not 240 per platform, but 160. By optimizing the grid, a triangular grid instead of a square one, the same angles Ethan had used in mine supports. A triangle distributes the load more effectively than a square. Ethan looked at the calculations. He checked the key formulas. He grunted. He asked how she'd come up with that. Lyra blushed and said she'd simply looked at the mine supports and thought that if a triangle works for walls, why wouldn't it work for the floor? Ethan said she was right. That it reduced the workload by a third. That she'd just saved them 2 months of work. Lyra blushed even more and buried her face in her notebook. Construction. Construction of Airholm Mala began in the 10th month. Mala meant small. The first version, a prototype city. The plan was as follows. 5 platforms connected by bridges. The central platform was large, 40 meters. It would house the workshops and administration. 4 smaller side platforms, 20 meters each. They would hold residential buildings and farms. The farms were a separate project. Ethan had thought about them for a long time. How to grow food in the air. Soil is needed. Water is needed. There's sunlight. But hauling soil up there is hard. Even lightweight soil. The solution came from Noelle. She was sitting in the infirmary, sorting through herbs. Ethan stopped by to ask her something and saw her holding a dry sprout. She placed it in a pot filled with crushed stone. She watered it. She placed her hands on the pot. A warm light, and the sprout began to grow. A green stem pushed its way out of the crushed stone as if it were black soil. Ethan stood there watching. Then he asked what she was doing. Noelle looked embarrassed. She said it was a side effect of her gift. She can heal not only people but plants too, if they trust her. She fell silent. Then she quietly added that it sounded silly. Plants can't trust anyone. Ethan said it wasn't silly at all. That trust might not be a rational process but a biological one. That a plant doesn't think but feels. And that if her gift worked on plants, then they had a solution to the problem with the farms. They wouldn't need soil. They'd need gravel, water, and Noel. She could accelerate growth, heal diseased crops, increase yields. A healer as a farmer as a healer. Noel looked at him. Her eyes sparkled. She asked if he really thought this was useful, not healing people but growing cabbage. Ethan replied that a hungry person wouldn't be able to appreciate healing. Feed them first, then heal them. And that growing food for 200 people was no less important a task than healing wounds. Noel nodded, quietly, seriously, and the next day, she went out to the field with a bag of seeds and a pot of rock dust. A week later, they had their first terraced garden beds at the edge of the platform. Stone troughs filled with gravel and water from the geothermal system. Noel walked among them morning and evening. Her hands glowed. The greens grew. A month later, the first harvest. Fresh greens in the mountains in winter. People ate and couldn't believe it. Construction continued. Borg forged the steel beams for the frames. Kamen checked every component. Tariq trained 2 new engravers from among the newcomers. Ethan personally inspected each one. The precision of the engraving was everything. A 1 millimeter error on a small anchor meant a 1 centimeter error on a large structure. And 1 centimeter at a height of 50 meters was a disaster. Ren reinforced the fabric for the walls and roofs. His wife taught 5 women how to sew the panels. Reinforced canvas on lightweight frames. Walls that weighed as much as a blanket but kept out the wind and rain. Dorn, the old man with the gift of sensing the wind, finally spoke. The launch of Air Home Mala was scheduled for dawn. 212 people, 5 platforms, 800 anchors. Everything checked. Everything counted. Lyra went over every point 3 times. Arthur checked every beam 3 times. Kemen inspected every stone 3 times. Ethan slept for 4 hours. He woke up on his own, before dawn. He stepped out into the darkness. The stars were large and close. The air was cold, quiet. In an hour, it would be noisy here. He walked across the platforms. He touched each central anchor. He felt a response. All 800 points pulsed as if alive. They were waiting. People were waking up. They were coming out of their homes, gathering on the central platform. Silently, without fuss. Children clung to their mothers. The elderly sat on the rocks. The miners stood in groups. Mira was the last to appear. She made her way through the crowd. She stood next to Ethan. She nodded. He nodded back. He turned to Lyra. She was standing with a chalkboard at the left edge of the platform, pale. Her hands, holding the chalk, were trembling, but her eyes were clear. She said that all systems were within specified parameters. She said this in a voice that sounded older than her 18 years. Ethan turned to Borg. He was standing by the forge. He folded his arms. He nodded. The frames were secured. He turned to Noel. She was in the infirmary. The bandages were laid out. The herbs were ready. The window was open, so she could hear what was happening outside. She raised her hand from the window. Ready. Hana was sitting on the step, writing. Number of people. Air temperature. Wind direction according to Dorn's data. East. Light. 3 meters per second. Good. Ethan placed his hands on the central anchor. The steel was cold beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes. 800 points. 5 platforms. Each with its own balance. Each with its own center of gravity. He couldn't keep all 800 in his head at once. He didn't have to. The system was designed in a cascading structure. The central anchor controlled 5 nodes. Each node controlled its own platform. 160 points on each subordinate platform obeyed their respective node. Ethan controlled 5 nodes, not all 800. That was his idea. A hierarchical control system. Just as a conductor doesn't direct every musician, but rather 5 sections. Each section knows its part. He gave the signal. The first node responded. The central platform trembled. Dust rained down. Someone cried out. The second node, the northern platform. The third, the southern one. The fourth, the eastern one. The fifth, the western one. All five came to life. Ethan balanced them, made adjustments. He listened. The ascent began slowly, centimeter by centimeter. The five platforms broke away from the bedrock simultaneously. The bridges between them strained. They creaked. They held. 1 meter, 2, 5. The ground receded below. Rocks and dust rained down from the edges. 10 meters, 20. The wind hit their faces. Dorn shouted that the wind was picking up. 8 meters per second, northwest. Lyra recalculated. She shouted the correction. Ethan adjusted the third knot. The southern platform sagged slightly and leveled out. 30 meters. 40. 50. The mountains were level with them. The clouds were close by. Mira stood beside her. She looked up, then down, then at Ethan. His face was gray with tension. The veins in his neck were bulging. His hands on the anchor had turned white. But his eyes were closed, and his face bore an expression of absolute concentration. 60 meters. 70. 80. 100. Ethan slowed his ascent. He stopped. 100 meters above ground level. 5 platforms hung in the morning sky like islands in an ocean of air. Below, the Kagra Mountains stretched out. Cracks hovered. The old mines were black dots. The road he'd destroyed 6 months ago was a thin line far below. He opened his eyes. He looked at the people. 212 faces. Children in their parents' arms. Old people on the rocks. Miners standing rooted to the spot. Borg with his mouth agape. Gareth white as a sheet. Noelle at the clinic window, her hands pressed to her chest. Lyra with a chalkboard and chalk, frozen a half step away. Hannah taking notes. Even now. Even at a height of 100 meters. Arthur went and stood at the edge of the western platform. The wind ruffled his white beard. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't wipe them away. He looked at the clouds that were below his feet, and he whispered something. Lyra later said that he kept repeating the same thing. We're flying. We're flying after all. Ethan took his hands off the anchor. The system was holding on its own. All 800 points were operating autonomously. The platforms were suspended steadily. Roll, 0. Pitch, 0. Drift, minimal. Dorn monitored the wind and reported back. Everything was normal. Ethan took a step back. His legs buckled. Mira caught him by the shoulder. She held him steady. He wanted to say thank you, but instead said, First day in the air, gravitational stability is normal. No settling. Tomorrow we'll start designing the second tier. And he lost consciousness. Mira held him. Noelle ran from the infirmary. Borg was already carrying water. Hannah was taking notes. The city floated above the clouds. He came to 6 hours later. Noelle was sitting next to him. Her hands were glowing. She was channeling energy into him, drop by drop. Carefully. Gently. He opened his eyes. He saw the ceiling. The ceiling was swaying slightly. No, not the ceiling. He was swaying. The city was swaying. Because the city was suspended in the air. He sat up. Noelle asked him to lie back down. He didn't. He stood up. He went outside. The sun was setting. The horizon was ablaze with orange and red. The clouds below were illuminated from beneath by the last rays of sunlight. And Airholm floated above them. Quiet, steady, alive. Children were running across the bridges between the platforms. Borg was hammering away in the smithy. Someone was preparing dinner. The air smelled of roasted meat and fresh herbs from Noelle's farms. Everyday life. 100 meters up, Mira approached. She said that while he was asleep, they'd had to solve 3 problems. The goats were afraid of heights and refused to eat. One child nearly fell off the edge. The water pump had started leaking due to the vibrations during the ascent. They calmed the goats down. They caught the child. Borg fixed the water pump. Ethan listened. He nodded. Then he said they needed railings. On every edge of every platform, every bridge, every staircase. Mira said she'd already given the order. Ethan looked at her. He said she handled things better than he did. Mira replied that she handled people, and he handled rocks, and that they'd both be better off sticking to their own business. 2 days later, Ethan discovered a problem, a serious one. The anchors on the side platforms were losing power, slowly, 0.5% a day. Everything was stable on the central platform, not on the side ones. He checked the engraving. Perfect. He checked the material. No defects. He checked Lyra's calculations. Flawless. The problem was with him, or rather, with the distance. The anchors he had personally activated lasted longer when he was nearby. His presence fueled them, not consciously, automatically, like body heat warms clothing. Rumors about Airholm reached Valengard 3 weeks later, a flying city in the Kagra Mountains, a place where exiles live in the sky, where the empty gifts work, where stonemasons build bridges without supports and healers grow cabbage from stones. The capital reacted in 3 ways. First, the Temple of the First Flame declared Airholm a heresy. The high priest delivered a sermon in the temple's golden hall. He said that heaven had granted the gifts for war, not for construction. That the flying city was a slap in the face of the First Flame. That the exiles had desecrated the divine order. Second, the royal court demanded a report from the commander of the punitive expedition. He reported that the trail had collapsed on its own, an earthquake. They did not believe him. An investigation was ordered. Third, the Dracorn Empire on the eastern border heard the same rumors and sent a scout. Suna Cho arrived in Airholm at the end of the 14th month. She did not come via the trail. The trail was no longer there. She climbed the cliffs at night in complete silence. Her gift of silence muffled all sounds within a 3-meter radius. Not a single stone creaked. Not a single boot scraped. She climbed to the edge of the lower platform. She climbed over the railing. She stood in the shadows. She looked around. And she froze. Because the city was beautiful. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected a filthy village on the rocks. A bunch of desperate, ragged people. Instead, she saw straight streets. Clean houses made of reinforced fabric on light frames. Streetlights on poles. Rooftop gardens with greenery. Workshops that smelled of metal and wood. A playground. A playground. In the flying city of exiles. There was a playground. She stood and watched. Then she moved deeper inside. Quietly. Silently. It peered into the windows. It listened. It gathered information. It memorized the layout of the buildings. It counted the people. It searched for weapons. There were no weapons. There were no barracks. There were no walls. There were workshops. There were farms. There were schools. And there was one person who wasn't sleeping. Ethan sat in the workshop. Before him were the expansion blueprints, the 6th platform, the 7th, the growth plan. A mug of hot broth stood nearby. He looked up. He glanced out the window. Nothing. Silence. Too much silence. Not even the crickets were chirping. He stood up. He went outside. He listened. Nothing. Absolute silence, as if someone had turned off the sound. He took a step forward. The silence was moving. It was coming from the southern edge of the platform toward the center. He walked toward it. Around the corner of the smithy, he came face to face with it. Short in stature, dark hair, piercing eyes. Her clothes were dark and form-fitting. 2 knives at her belt, a rolled-up parchment in her hand, a spy. They stood facing each other. 3 seconds. 5. She could have run. He couldn't stop her. His gift didn't work on living beings. He couldn't make her heavier or lighter. She could have simply turned around and jumped off the platform into the darkness. Ethan did something she didn't expect. He asked if she wanted some tea. Hot tea. Because it's cold in the mountains at night, and she looked frozen. Sun A blinked. Then she blinked again. The gift of silence wavered. Sounds returned. The wind, crickets, the creak of wood. She asked if he wouldn't call the guards. Ethan replied that they had no guards. There were sentries patrolling the perimeter, but no guards. This isn't a fortress. It's a city. She asked, "What if I'm here to kill him?" Ethan replied that if she wanted to kill him, she would have done so already. She had been standing 3 meters from his bedroom just 5 minutes ago. He'd seen footprints in the dust by his window. So she hadn't come to kill him. She'd come to watch. Sun A narrowed her eyes. Then she took her hands off the knives. She said that she'd have some tea. They were sitting in the workshop. Ethan brewed a fresh infusion of mountain herbs. Not coffee. There was no coffee here. That was his constant pain. Sona drank and remained silent. Then she began asking questions. How the platforms worked. How many people? What kind of weapons? What gifts? Ethan answered everything. Openly. No tricks. Number of people. 230. Weapons. Picks and hammers. Gifts. Empty. Every single one. She looked at him, waiting for a catch. She didn't find one. She asked why he was telling her all this. Ethan replied that it was because he had nothing to hide. Airhome isn't a weapon. It's a home. If the Dracorn Empire wants to learn how to build flying platforms, he's ready to explain. For a fair price. Food, materials, tools, people. Especially people with empty gifts, who are also branded and cast out in the Empire. Sona was silent for a long time. Then she said he was either a genius or a madman. Ethan replied that he was most likely both. She stayed. Not because she wanted to, because her orders were to observe and report. And it's easier to observe from the inside than from the outside. Mira was against it. She said that having a spy in the city was like a knife in the back. Ethan replied that a knife you can see is less dangerous than one you can't. Let her watch. Let her write reports. The more the Empire learns about them, the better. Because the truth was on their side. Mira said he was naive. Ethan replied that perhaps he was, but that they had no way of stopping her anyway. She could mute the sound and leave whenever she wanted, so it was better to make sure she didn't want to. Sleepe watched. She walked around the city. She talked to people. She took notes. And every day she saw the same thing. People were building, not for war, for life. Workshops made tools, not weapons. Farms grew food, not poisons. Schools taught children to count, not to kill. And every evening, Ethan sat in his workshop and drew blueprints for the next platform. Not fortresses, homes. 2 weeks later, Son-A caught herself realizing that that morning she hadn't recorded the coordinates of the new anchors in her report for the Empire. She'd forgotten. Or maybe she didn't want to. She wasn't sure. Ethan noticed the change. One evening, he asked her what she herself wanted to do. Not for the Empire, not for the mission. Just her. What she liked. What made her happy. Son-A was silent. For a long time. Then she said she didn't know. That she'd spent her whole life following orders. That she didn't have a single thing that belonged only to her. Then she fell silent. Then she quietly added that a long time ago, her grandmother had taught her how to cook. A spicy soup made with cabbage and peppers. And that it was the only memory in which she felt warmth. Ethan remembered. A week later, a small kitchen appeared in the corner of the central platform. A stone stove, a spice rack, pots that Borg had forged himself. Next to it, a patch of peppers from Noelle's farm. Ethan said it was for her. That everyone in Airhome should have a place that belongs only to them. A place where they can do what they love. Not for practicality, not for a mission, just for themselves. Sona stood in front of the kitchen, running her fingers along the spice rack. Then the pot. Then the stove. Her hands were shaking. She turned around and walked away quickly. But that evening, the smell of spicy soup wafted from the kitchen. Mira tasted it. She said it was the best thing she'd eaten in 10 years. Noelle tasted it and coughed from the pepper. Hannah wrote down the recipe. Lyra asked if she could have seconds. Sona stood in front of the stove. She watched as the people she was supposed to betray ate her soup, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to write in her report. In the 16th month, a woman came to Airhome who changed everything. She wasn't alone. She had a child with her, an old beggar woman in rags. The boy was about 5 years old, barefoot, skinny. His eyes were huge and empty. They had walked 200 kilometers from the province of Kelmar. A sentry reported to Mira. Mira descended on a cable platform. Ethan went with her. The woman stood at the foot of the mountain and looked up. At the flying city. At the platforms hanging in the morning sky like stone clouds. At the farms. At the houses. At the Airhome flag that Hannah had drawn a month ago. A crossed-out circle on a white background. The mark of an outcast. Turned upside down. From a mark of shame to a mark of belonging. The woman fell to her knees. She held the child in front of her. She spoke quickly and incoherently. The boy's name is Min. He has a gift. He can make water a little colder. Just a little. By a few degrees. In their village, they want to drown him. They call him devilish. They call him cursed. She took him in the night and fled. 200 kilometers. Through the mountains. Without food. Without shoes. She'd heard there was a place, in the mountains, where they take children like him, where they're needed. She begged him to take the boy. Just him. She could leave. She wasn't needed. Just him. Please. Ethan stood there and listened. He looked at the boy. Min wasn't crying. He wasn't afraid. He just stood there, looking at Ethan with his huge eyes, as if everything had already been decided and he was simply waiting. Ethan bent down. He held out his arms. The boy stepped toward him. Ethan lifted him up. The child was as light as an empty basket, skin and bones. He turned to the people who had come down with him. About 20 of them, Mira, Noel, Borg, and a few miners. They stood and watched. Ethan said that they now had a food cooling system, that they would have refrigerators. Someone laughed. Someone didn't understand. Mira understood. If the boy could cool water, then he could cool any liquid. Milk, broth, decoctions, juice, anything that spoils in the heat. In the mountains, where there's no winter ice all year round, this meant preserved food, preserved medicine, preserved lives. Min didn't understand what was happening. He was sitting in a stranger's arms, looking around. Then Ethan placed a mug of water in front of him. He asked him to make it colder. The boy touched the mug with his finger. The water became ice cold. Not just a little colder. Ice cold. The sides of the mug were covered with frost. Ethan looked at Mira. Mira looked at Ethan. The boy asked if he'd done it wrong. Ethan replied that he'd done it perfectly, and that tomorrow morning they'd start building a special room for him, where he'd cool food for the whole city. And that this would be his job, an important job. The boy asked if his mom could stay. Ethan said of course she could, that he needed a cook, because Son A couldn't cook for 200 people all by herself. The woman was kneeling and crying. Mira helped her up, took her to the city, gave her a home, gave her food, gave her a job. Min became a project. Ethan built an entire engineering system around him, a stone chamber with insulated walls. Inside were shelves for food. Min sat in the center and, once a day, cooled the air inside the chamber to the required temperature. Food didn't spoil. Milk kept for a week, meat for 2. Noel's herbs retained their properties for months. The boy worked for an hour a day. The rest of the time, he ran around the platforms with the other children. For the first time in his life, he had friends. For the first time, he wasn't beaten or hidden away. He was needed. His mother cooked. It turned out she was an excellent cook. Sone found a kindred spirit in her. The two of them stood in the kitchen together, debating spices. It was Sone's first friendship in Airholm, not with Ethan, not with Mira, with the cook. With a woman who understood that hot peppers were a serious matter. 2 weeks later, news arrived that turned everything upside down. Dorn sensed it first. The wind had changed, abruptly. Not from the northwest, but from the south. Hot. Dry. A wind like that blew only before one event. An army on the march. Thousands of feet kicking up dust. The dust heats the air. The wind changes the air. Dorn went to Ethan and said that something big was coming from the south. Ethan climbed to the highest point in the city. He looked south. He saw nothing. But Dorn could sense it through the wind. He said the source was 100 kilometers away, moving toward them, fast. Ethan came back down. He convened a council. Mira, Lyra, Borg, Gareth. Sone came on her own, uninvited. She sat in a corner. Ethan looked at her. She said that if an army was coming, it wasn't the Dracorn. The Dracorn attacks from the east, not the south. From the south, it can only be Valengard. Mira turned pale. The Royal Army. Not a punitive detachment of 20 horsemen, an army. Ethan asked Son A how many Valengard usually sent to suppress a rebellion. Sun A answered without hesitation. A regiment. 800 fighters. 300 of them with the gifts of destruction. Fire, lightning, ice. Silence hung over the table. 800 against 230. 300 battle mages against 0. Ethan looked at each of them. Mira, her face stony. Lyra, pale but clutching a tablet. Borg, his fists clenched. Gareth, grim. Sun A, calm. Professionally calm. Ethan said they had the advantage. The city was in the air. The army was on the ground. They couldn't reach us. Mira said they could. Fire mages could strike up to 300 meters. Lightning mages even farther. Ethan nodded. So they needed to rise higher. Lyra raised her hand. She said their current altitude was 100 meters. The maximum calculated altitude for the current anchor configuration is 800 meters. But rising above 300 would require reconfiguring the entire network. At least 2 days. Ethan asked how much time they had. Dorn replied that at the current wind speed, the army would be at the mountains in 4 days. Crossing the mountains would take another day. 5 days. Ethan stood up. He said that in 5 days they would raise the city by 500 meters, out of reach of any gift of destruction. And then they'd watch as the army stood below, trying to figure out what to do with a fortress it couldn't reach. Work began immediately, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. Ethan readjusted the anchors. Lyra recalculated the loads. Tariq and his engravers made adjustments to every joint. Borg forged reinforced plates for the key points. Min inspected. Hana took notes. Mira allocated personnel and resources. Noel treated those who collapsed from exhaustion. Sonae stood at the edge of the platform and looked south. She was thinking. Then she turned and walked over to Ethan. She said she could help. Her gift of silence could muffle more than just sound. If she concentrated harder, she could dampen vibrations in materials. This would stabilize the structure during the ascent and eliminate resonance. Ethan stopped. He looked at her. He asked if she was sure she wanted to help. Because that meant she was choosing a side. Sun A was silent. Then she said she'd chosen a side the moment he built her kitchen. She just hadn't wanted to admit it to herself. Ethan nodded. He said, "Welcome to the team." 5 days. 120 hours. Every minute counted. Ethan hadn't slept for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, Mira personally led him to bed and told him that if he died of exhaustion, the city would fall with him. He slept for 4 hours. He got up. He continued. Reconfiguring the anchors was more complicated than the initial installation. Every node had to be recalibrated. The vector had to be adjusted. The power had to be increased. The balance had to be checked. 800 points. Each one required attention. Lyra worked beside him. She didn't leave his side. She calculated non-stop, board after board, notebook after notebook. Her fingers were white from chalk. Her eyes were red. But she didn't stop. When Ethan fell asleep, she kept calculating. When he woke up, she showed him the finished results. Double-checked. Tariq and his 2 students engraved the corrections. Their hands ached. The chisels grew dull. Borg sharpened new ones every 3 hours. Min walked from node to node, listening to the stone. The tension has increased here. There's a crack here. A block needs to be replaced here. Arthur went and followed him, confirming every word. Sun A stood at key points, dampening the vibrations. Her gift of silence worked deeper than anyone had imagined. She wasn't just eliminating sound. She was eliminating vibrations in the very structure of the material. The stone beneath her hands became completely motionless. No tremors. No resonance. The anchors within her zone of influence operated 20% more efficiently. Ethan realized this on the 2nd day and assigned her to the most unstable node, the southern platform, the one that always sagged slightly. Sun A stood there and didn't move for 12 hours. When Noel came to check on her, Sun A said she was fine. Noel replied that she was a doctor and that she was the one who decided what was fine. She placed her hands on Sun A's shoulders. A warm light coursed through her body. Sun A shuddered. She looked at Noel. She said that no one had ever treated her just like that before, without an order. Noel replied that orders had nothing to do with it. She was tired and needed help. Sun A was silent for a second. Then she said thank you, quietly, as if she'd uttered an unfamiliar word. On the fourth day, Dorn reported that the army had entered the foothills. The dust was visible to the naked eye, a column of gray haze on the southern horizon. Ethan climbed to the edge of the platform and looked out. Far below, a dark ribbon moved between the mountains. 800 men, horses, wagons, Valengard's banners. A golden flame against a black background. At the front rode a horseman in a white robe. Even from this distance, Ethan recognized him. Renard Valancourt, Grand Master of the Academy of the Seven Pillars. The very man who had branded him. He had come in person. Mira stood beside him. She said that the Grand Master wasn't the type to send others. He came himself, so this must be serious. Ethan nodded. He asked if the anchors were ready. Lyra shouted from the central platform. Ready! All 800 have been recalibrated. Checked. Balance is normal. Maximum calculated altitude, 700 meters. Ethan said, Good. We'll take off tomorrow at dawn. When they're at the foot of the mountain and see everything with their own eyes. The night was long. No one slept. The children huddled close to their mothers. The elders sat by the campfires. The miners sharpened their pickaxes, even though everyone knew that a pickaxe against a fire mage was like a stick against lightning. But their hands had to be busy. Otherwise, fear would eat them up from the inside. Ethan walked around the city. He talked to people. He didn't give speeches. He didn't promise victory. He just asked how things were going. Did they need water? Were the children warm? Were there enough blankets? Small questions. But they made things feel a little easier. Noel followed behind him. She healed those who couldn't sleep because of their anxiety. Her gift didn't work directly on fear, but the warmth of her hands and the soft light were soothing. People fell asleep, not because of magic, it was because of trust. Junho Park had arrived 3 months ago. Ethan remembered how it had happened. A tall woman in a tattered guard's uniform, a scar across her eyebrow, her back straight as a pillar, a brand on her wrist. A former captain of the Royal Guard, stripped of her rank for refusing to execute peasants. Her gift of resilience kept her from falling, not from a blow, not from a shove, not from an explosion. At the academy, they considered it second-rate. She arrived in Airholm in silence. She stood before Mira. She said she knew how to fight, that she could protect. Mira took her to Ethan. He asked why she'd been stripped of her rank. She answered honestly. She'd received an order to execute 20 peasants for failing to pay taxes. She refused. She was arrested, put on trial, branded. She left of her own accord. Ethan asked if she regretted it. Junho replied that she regretted it every day, not the decision itself, but the fact that she hadn't been able to save those peasants. She had only refused to kill them, but someone else had killed them. Ethan told her that she hadn't betrayed her oath, that she had fulfilled it, her true oath. It was just that the crown had written the wrong one. Junho stood there looking at him. Her face was stony, but something shifted in her eyes, like a rock that shifted a millimeter after an earthquake. He appointed her commander of the Airholm Guard. She organized the sentries, the patrols, the signaling system, without weapons. No army, just order, discipline, readiness. Now, on the night before the siege, Junho stood at the edge of the platform and looked down. At the campfires of the Royal Army, 800 torches, like a sea of fire at the foot of the mountains. Ethan approached. He stood beside her. She said she knew these people. She'd served with them. She'd taught some of them. Some of them had taught her. Now they'd come to kill those she was protecting. Ethan said no one would die, neither up there nor down below. Junho looked at him. She asked how he could promise that. Ethan replied that he wasn't promising anything. He plans to. Dawn. Ethan stood in the center of the platform, his hands on the anchor. Everyone stood around him. 237 people, each in their place. Mira nearby, Lyra at the calculation board, Borg at the forge, Noel in the infirmary, Sun A at the southern hub. Junho was on the perimeter. Hana was on the steps with a notebook. Dorn was up in the mast, listening to the wind. Little Min was in his mother's arms. Arthur Wenton was at the edge of the western platform. Below, the army was forming into battle formation. Banners fluttered. Master Valancourt stood at the front, a white robe, fire in his palms. He looked up at the flying city, and the city looked down at him. Ethan closed his eyes. He took a drag. The ascent began slowly, just like the first time, centimeter by centimeter. But now the scale was different. Not just one platform. 5. Not 50 meters. 500. Ethan could feel every anchor. 800 points sang in his head like an orchestra. 5 keynotes. Each controlled its own section. He pulled them upward, smoothly, steadily. 100 meters. Standard altitude. The platforms passed it easily. As usual. 200 meters. The wind picked up. Dorn called out a gust from the west. 12 meters per second. Lyra recalculated. Adjustment for the third knot. Ethan made the correction. 300 meters. This was where uncharted territory began. The anchors were working at the limit of their previous settings. The new calibration took effect. The platforms shook. One bridge creaked so loudly that Borg cursed and grabbed the railing, but it held. 400 meters. The air grew thinner, colder. The children began to cry. Their ears were popping. Noelle walked among the people, warming them with her gift. She wasn't healing them, just warming them. The warmth of her hands, the warmth presence. The army below was already a tiny speck, torches like dots, banners like colored blobs. But Master Valancourt saw, and acted. The first strike came at an altitude of 450 meters. A pillar of fire shot up from below, bright, blinding. It struck the base of the eastern platform. The stone cracked, sparks flew, people screamed. Junho stood at the edge. The blast passed 3 meters from her. The heat scorched her face. She didn't flinch. Her gift held her steady. The second strike. Lightning. Blue. Thin. It struck the bridge between the central and northern platforms. The planks burst into flames. Borg rushed to put them out. A third strike. Ice. A massive chunk of ice the size of a cart shot up from below and slammed into the bottom of the southern platform. Sun A was standing directly above the point of impact. She felt the vibration. She activated the DAR. She quelled the vibrations. The platform held. Ethan held on. Hands on the anchor. Eyes closed. Face ashen. Each blow passed through the system and struck him, as if someone were hammering the strings of a grand piano while he tried to play a symphony. 500 meters. He covered the last 50 meters quickly, in a single burst of effort. The platforms flew up, as if tossed into the air. People fell to the floor. Mira fell. Ethan felt something crack inside him. Not a bone. Deeper, as if the gift itself had cracked under the strain. 500 meters. He stopped the ascent. He locked it in place. He opened his eyes. Below, the army was a scattering of dots. Valancourt's fire shot up once more. It didn't reach. It dissipated at 400 meters. Lightning struck. It didn't reach. The ice rose and fell back down. 500 meters. Out of reach. Junho stood at the edge and counted the strikes. 12. Then 13. 14. Each one weaker than the last. The mages below were running out of steam. Their gifts were designed for the battlefield, for the horizontal plane. Striking upward half a kilometer is like shouting at the sky. It's possible, but pointless. By noon, the strikes had ceased. The army stood below, looking up. The city hung above them, inaccessible, unattainable. Magister Valancourt stood before his officers. The fire in his palms had gone out. For the first time in 40 years of service, his gift of destruction was useless. He couldn't burn what he couldn't reach. The siege began. The army set up camp at the foot of the mountains. Tents, campfires, patrols. They waited. No one knew exactly what for. Perhaps the city would fall on its own. Perhaps the inhabitants would come down, driven by hunger. Perhaps an order from Valengard. Ethan lay in the infirmary. Noelle sat beside him. Her hands on his chest glowed. He was in bad shape. The final sprint over the last 50 meters had damaged something. Not in his body. In the connection between him and the gift. The anchors obeyed him, but with a delay. As if a thin wall had appeared between him and them. Noelle said she didn't know how to treat it. She heals the body, but this isn't the body. It's something else. Ethan said he knew. It was an overload, like a blown fuse. It'll take time. Rest. A week. Maybe 2. Mira arrived an hour later. She sat down next to him. She asked how long the city would hold out without him. Ethan replied that the anchors operate autonomously. The city won't fall. But if a correction is needed, he won't be able to make it right now. Mira nodded. She said they had enough food for 3 months. Water from the geothermal system. Noel's farms provide greens. Min is keeping the supplies cool. They could hang out here for a long time, longer than the army can hold out down there. Because the army needs to be fed. And the fields of Kagra down below have long been abandoned. Ethan smirked. He said it was a siege in reverse. They were up here with food and water. The army was down there without supplies. Time was on their side. Mira replied that time was only on their side if he recovered. Ethan closed his eyes. He said he would recover. The days passed. The army stood its ground. The city hung in the balance. Nothing happened. That was the hardest part. The waiting. People were on edge. Children asked when they could go back down. The elderly grumbled that the air up here was too thin. Junho kept order. Silently. With her mere presence. When she walked down the street, people stood up straight. Not out of fear. Out of respect. She was a rock. Unbreakable. And everyone could see that. On the 3rd day of the siege, Son-A came to Ethan. She said she could go down at night. Quietly. Unnoticed. To scout out the camp. To find out their plans. Ethan said no. It was too dangerous. Son-A said that danger was her profession. Ethan said that her profession was no longer espionage. Her profession was structural stabilization. She was needed here. Son-A argued. Ethan wouldn't back down. Mira intervened. She said Ethan was right. Son-A was needed up there. But reconnaissance was needed too. There was another way. Hana. Her gift of precise memory allowed her to memorize everything she saw. Remember a platform 500 meters high, you can see far. Give her a telescope and she'll memorize every face, every tent, every movement down below. Ethan asked Borg to make a telescope. Borg looked at him as if he were crazy. Then Ethan explained the principle. 2 lenses in the tube. One collects light. The other magnifies it. The lenses could be made from mountain quartz, transparent and polished. Borg thought about it for 2 days. Then he made it, roughly, crookedly, but it worked. Hana received the telescope and spent 12 hours at the edge of the platform. Then she went to Ethan and reported 214 tents, 390 horses. The officer's tent is in the center. The magister comes out 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. He stands there and looks up. The officers gather for a council every evening. The food supply wagon arrived once in 3 days. It was small, 10 wagons. That wasn't enough for 800 men. Ethan nodded. The army was starving. Not yet, but in 2 weeks it would begin. He was right. On the 10th day of the siege, the supply train didn't arrive. On the 12th day, a group of horsemen left the camp, 30 men, headed south, in search of food. The army had shrunk. On the 15th day, Kana reported that there were now 180 tents. Some had been taken down. People had left. Not deserters. Sent out for supplies. On the 20th day, the army below numbered 500 men. The lights grew fewer. The camp had shrunk. Magister Valancourt would step out of his tent every evening and stand alone. He looked up. At the city he could not reach. At the people he had once branded and cast out, who were now flying overhead. Ethan was recovering. Slowly. His connection to the gift was being restored. Noelle was helping. Every day. Her hands on his shoulders. Warm light. She couldn't heal the gift, but she could heal the body that carried the gift. And the body was healing. And with it, the connection. On the 23rd day, Ethan got out of bed and walked across all the platforms. He touched every anchor. They all responded, clearly, precisely, without delay. He was back. He told Mira he was ready. On the 24th day of the siege, Ethan did what no one expected. He went down. Alone. On a cable platform, a small wooden platform suspended by 2 cables with a winch at the top. Mira said he was crazy. Junho said she'd go with him. Ethan said no. Alone. Unarmed. Without an escort. Mira grabbed him by the sleeve. She asked why. Ethan replied that he wanted to talk to Valancourt in person. Mira said Valancourt would burn him on the spot. Ethan replied that he wouldn't, because Valancourt had been standing there for 23 days looking up. He isn't commanding attacks. He isn't building siege engines. He isn't looking for workarounds. He's just standing there, looking up. That's not the behavior of a commander. It's the behavior of a man who's thinking. Mira wouldn't let go of his sleeve. Ethan gently removed her hand. He said that if he didn't return in 2 hours, they should raise the platform and head north. Lyra knows how to operate the anchors, not as well as he does, but well enough to hold the city. Mira looked into his eyes for a long time, then she let go. She said 2 hours, not a minute more. The platform began to descend. 500 meters. A long descent. The wind ruffled her hair. Clouds drifted by. The ground was getting closer. The camp was growing larger. Tents, campfires, faces. The platform touched down 100 meters from the camp. Ethan stepped off. He walked forward, alone, unarmed, with a brand on his wrist. The soldiers saw him first. They jumped to their feet. They grabbed their swords. Someone shouted, "Alert!" A fire mage raised his hand. A flame flared up. Ethan kept walking. He didn't stop. He didn't speed up. He walked at a steady pace, arms at his sides, palms open. An officer ran out of the tent. He saw him, froze, then shouted not to shoot. Ethan reached the center of the camp. He stopped in front of the officer's tent. The curtain parted. Renard Valancourt stepped out. A white robe, a silver clasp shaped like a flame. The same cold eyes, the same direct gaze. But there were more wrinkles now. Or perhaps Ethan hadn't noticed them before. They stood facing each other. The Magister and the outcast. The man who had branded him and the man who had been branded. Valancourt spoke first. He said that Ethan was either very brave or very foolish. Ethan replied that he was, more likely, very tired, and that he had come not to fight but to talk. Valancourt was silent. Then with a gesture he dismissed the soldiers. The two of them remained alone in front of the tent. Ethan said he knew why the Magister had come in person. Not to burn a handful of outcasts. Any colonel would have sufficed for that. Valancourt had come because he had seen the impossible. A city that flies. A gift that works differently than what's written in the textbooks. A system that shouldn't exist. And the master wants to understand. Because if this is true, then everything he's taught for 40 years is a lie. Valancourt listened. His face was inscrutable. But his hands, which usually blazed with fire, were now extinguished. Ethan continued. He said that the earth is sinking, not just in Ka, Greece, across the entire continent. Valengard will be submerged in 20 years, along with the academy, along with the temple, along with all the useful gifts that will be powerless against a sinking continent. Because you can't raise the ground with fire. You can't stop a landslide with lightning. You can't freeze tectonic plates with ice, but you can with the empty gifts. Valancourt asked how he knew this. Ethan replied that he was an engineer, that he saw the cracks, calculated the rate of subsidence, measured the water level, that the data doesn't lie, and that the data says one thing: the continent is dying. Valancourt was silent for a long time. The wind ruffled the hem of his robe. Then he said one thing Ethan hadn't expected. He said he knew, that the academy had known for 50 years, that the measurements were being taken in secret, that the ground beneath Valengard is subsiding by 3 centimeters a year, and that no one knows what to do about it. Ethan stood there, looking at the old man. At a man who had known for 50 years that the world was perishing and had done nothing. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. Because the only answer lay in the gifts, which he himself had declared useless. To admit this meant admitting that thousands of those executed and exiled were innocent, that the entire system was a mistake, that he personally had ruined the lives of those who could have saved the world. Ethan understood. He understood why Valancourt had stood there for 23 nights, staring upward. Not out of anger, out of horror. He had seen the answer to the question that had tormented him for half a century. And the answer said that he was an executioner. Ethan said that the past cannot be changed, that the dead cannot be brought back, but that the future can still be built, and that he needed help. Not an army, not fire, information, the Academy's archives, records of every exile over the past 300 years, where they were sent, where they went, who survived. Because each of them is a potential anchor in the network that can lift the continent. Valancourt looked at him. A flame flared up in his right palm. A reflex. A habit. He extinguished it. He said that Ethan was asking him to betray everything he believed in. Ethan replied that no, he was asking him to finally believe the truth. Silence. 1 minute. 2. 3. Then Valancourt turned around. He entered the tent. He came out a minute later. He was holding a scroll in his hands. He handed it to Ethan. He said it was a copy of the Register of Exiles from the past 100 years. The army left the next morning, just as Valancourt had said. Hannah confirmed it through her spyglass. The tents were rolled up. The horses were saddled. The column set off southward. Dust rose and dissipated. Airholm descended 200 meters. 500 had been too high. The air was too thin. The children were sick from the pressure. 300 meters became their operating altitude. Safe enough. Comfortable enough. Ethan opened the Valancourt registry in the workshop. Hannah sat down beside him. She read every line, memorized it. 1,200 names over 100 years. Of those, perhaps 300 might still be alive. Maybe 400. Scattered across the entire continent, in the mines, in the villages, in the forests. Some had drunk themselves to death. Some had died. Some had forgotten they ever had a gift. Ethan knew he needed every single one of them. The problem of anchors fading at a distance demanded a solution. Alone, he could hold the city. 10 bearers of the empty gifts could hold the continent. He began to make plans. Envoys. Small groups of 3 or 4 people. They would travel through the provinces. They would search for the exiles. Explain. Invite them to Airholm. Train them. Junho volunteered to lead the first group. Ethan agreed. She knew the roads. She knew the people. She knew how to speak to those who had lost hope, because she herself had once lost it. The first group left a week later. Junho and 4 volunteers. They descended on a cable platform. They headed east. The second group went west. The third went north. Ethan stood at the edge and watched them leave. Tiny figures on mountain trails. Each carried in their pocket a copy of the map marked with entries from the registry. Addresses, names, gifts. Each marked as useless. Each potentially capable of holding up the sky. While the groups were on their way, Ethan was building. The 6th platform. The 7th. The 8th. The city was growing. New houses, new workshops, new farms. Lyra oversaw the calculations. She had grown over the past year, not physically, internally. From a shy girl with a slate, she had become the chief engineer, second only to Ethan, his equal in mathematics, sometimes even better. She saw solutions he missed, found errors he overlooked, argued with him, loudly, with eyes ablaze. And every time he said, "You're right," she'd blush and look away. Arthur Wenton had come back to life. For good. 20 years of madness had receded like fog. He walked around the construction site, upright and confident. He touched the beams. He listened to the stone. He told the young engineers that this structure would stand for 100 years, while that one wouldn't even last 3. And he was right. His drawings from 20 years ago hung in frames in the workshop. Like a relic. Like a reminder. Ren and his team of 12 weavers produced reinforced panels for walls and roofs. Each panel was as light as paper and as strong as a plank. A composite material. On Earth, they'd pay billions for this kind of technology. Here, it was made by a former shirt mender with an empty brand on his wrist. The population surpassed 400, then 500, then 600. New people arrived every week, not just outcasts, ordinary folk, artisans, even a few minor nobles who were tired of languishing in the provinces. Airholm welcomed everyone. There was work for everyone. Every gift found a use. The woman who could change the color of a stone became an artist. She decorated the walls. The man who could hear sounds from a kilometer away became a communications operator between the platforms. The boy who could make dust move became a janitor. And then Ethan figured out how to use his gift to polish lenses, and the boy became a master of optical instruments. There are no useless skills, a motto that became law. Ethan opened a school, a real one, not the Academy of the Seven Pillars, where children were sorted by their usefulness. A school where they taught counting, reading, and thinking, where every gift was studied not as a weapon but as a tool, where the question wasn't how many enemies he would kill, but what could be built with his gift. Hana kept the school's records. She recorded every student's achievements, every discovery, every new idea. The notebooks multiplied, the stacks grew. Ethan built her a separate room, with shelves, with windows, the Airholm archives, the city's memory. 2 months later, Junho's first group returned. 32 people came with her, exiles from the eastern provinces. Each had an empty gift. Each had been a nobody. Now each was needed. Junho was different, softer, not in her movements but in her eyes. She had seen how the exiles lived beyond the borders of Airholm. Hunger, disease, humiliation, beatings. And she saw how they raised their heads when they heard that somewhere in the mountains there was a place, where the brand on the wrist was not a curse, but a sign of belonging. She came to Ethan that evening. She stood in the doorway of the workshop. She was silent. Then she said she wanted to go back, to set out again, to keep searching, because there were still hundreds more out there. Ethan nodded. He said she could go whenever she was ready. Junho paused. Then she said one more thing. She said that when she left the guard, she thought her life was over, that she had betrayed everything for the sake of 20 peasants who were killed anyway, that it had been pointless. But now she stands in the flying city, leading home the people the world has cast aside, and that it wasn't pointless. Ethan replied that there are no pointless actions. There are actions whose meaning becomes clear later. Junho nodded. The corner of her mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. Almost. Ethan began training new bearers of the empty gifts. Not everyone could do what he did. Not everyone could. But every empty gift had one thing in common: a connection to gravity, the ability to influence the fundamental forces of the world. Some could make objects slightly lighter, others slightly heavier. Some could alter friction, others elasticity. All of these were facets of a single crystal. Facets of what the ancient Eris called gravity. Ethan taught them, one by one, in pairs. He explained the physics. He demonstrated the anchors. He assigned tasks. Gradually, the network grew. 5 people could power the anchors on the northern platforms, 3 on the southern ones, 2 on the eastern ones. The burden on Ethan lessened. The city became more stable. Fewer subsidence events, fewer corrections. The system functioned as a distributed network, just as the cities of the air had functioned 300 years ago. Ethan knew this, because at the end of the second year, he found the archive, not in Valengard, in the Kagra Mountains, deep underground, in a mine that was considered cursed, the very one where no one ever went. K-Min found the entrance. His gift for seeing cracks revealed that behind the wall of rubble lay a void, a large one, regularly shaped, not natural, man-made. They cleared the passage in 3 days. Ethan chipped away at the rocks. Borg cut through the metal rebar rods that pierced the rubble, old ones, 300 years old, but still intact. Beyond the rubble was a room, round. The walls were covered with engravings, anchors, thousands of anchors, dead, extinct for centuries. But the pattern was clear. Ethan recognized it. These were the same patterns he had carved into his platforms, the same principles, the same physics. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. A metal plate lay upon it. Words in an ancient language were engraved on the plate. Hana read them. Her gift allowed her to memorize languages as easily as numbers. She had learned the ancient language from the fragments of inscriptions on the walls in 2 days. The plate stated that this was the 7th node of the Celestial Vaults network, one of the 120 nodes that held the continent of Erdalia in the sky. That the network had been destroyed intentionally. That a coalition of destruction mages had brought down the nodes one by one, because Erdalian society was too egalitarian, too equal. There was no place for the chosen few. There was no hierarchy of power. A stonemason with the gift of ease stood on equal footing with a warrior with the gift of fire. And the warriors would not tolerate it. They brought down the sky. They killed the air. They rewrote history. They declared the empty gifts to be trash. And they built a world where a person's worth is measured by how many enemies they can kill in a minute. 300 years of lies. Ethan stood in an ancient room and read the words written 300 years ago. And the last lines on the tablet were these. The sky fell but did not perish. It waits. For the one who remembers. For the one who will restore it. For the one who will lift the earth back up. Next to the text, a map was engraved. 120 points. 120 nodes. Scattered across the entire continent. Each node is a place where an anchor can be restored. Each anchor is a point in the network that can lift Erdalia back into the sky. Ethan stood there and counted. 120 nodes. At least 3 bearers of the empty gifts for each. 360 people. Plus a reserve. Plus training. Plus coordination. 500 people. Maybe 600. With the empty gifts. Trained, ready. Deployed across the entire continent, activating the network simultaneously. The largest engineering operation in the history of the world. Impossible. Insane. The only right thing to do. He walked out of the room. He looked up at the sky, at the clouds, at the city hanging overhead. Then he looked at the ground, at the cracks, at the sinking rock, at the world slowly sinking. And he said quietly, "All right, let's go." 3 years. 1,095 days since that morning when Ethan opened his eyes on the stone floor of the exam hall. Airholm hung 300 meters above the Kagri Mountains. 12 platforms. 1,400 residents. Farms on the terraces. Workshops. A school. A clinic. An archive. A blacksmith shop. A market where labor, not gold, was traded. A playground with swings that Borg had forged from lightweight steel. Mira's bathhouse. Son A's kitchen. June's testing ground, Ho. Lyra's laboratory. Mina's cold storage chamber. And Etan's drafting room. A small room on the upper level of the central platform. With a window facing east, overlooking the clouds. With walls covered in maps and diagrams. A map of the continent. 120 locations. Over the course of 3 years, Airholm's emissaries found 470 bearers of the empty gifts. Alive. Across the entire continent. In mines. In villages. In slums. In prisons. In forests. They found every one of them. They explained it to every one of them. They trained every one of them. Not all of them came to Airholm. Not all of them were supposed to. Each remained in their place, near one of the 120 ancient nodes, waiting, preparing, training. Ethan trained 12 instructors. Each instructor trained 10 others. Each of the 10 knew how to activate a node, how to set an anchor, how to direct a vector, how to maintain the network. The network was ready. Not completely. Of the 120 nodes, 103 had been restored. 17 remained damaged or inaccessible. Lyra calculated that 103 would be enough. The safety margin was threefold. If 30 nodes failed, the net would hold. If 50 failed, the situation would be critical. If 70 failed, the net would collapse. 103 out of 120, 86%. Ethan would have liked more, but there was no time. The cracks were spreading. The province of Kelmar in the west had been submerged 2 months ago. An entire city, 8,000 people. Half were evacuated, the rest drowned. Valengard was creaking. The royal palace had tilted 2 degrees. The temple of the first flame was covered in cracks from the foundation to the dome. The high priest declared that heaven was angry. He demanded new sacrifices, new exiles. As if sacrificing another 100 people would stop the tectonic shifts. Renard Valancourt sent a letter, via a secret courier. He wrote that the Academy's archives were open, that he'd found documents about the catastrophe, that the truth was worse than he'd thought, that the Mages Coalition hadn't just brought down the network, they had installed suppressors, devices that blocked the empty gifts in specific zones. Some of the suppressors were still operational, 3 centuries later. That was why certain nodes couldn't be restored. Valancourt had found the schematics for the suppressors and sent a copy. Ethan studied them. The suppressors were simple. Metal rods with reverse anchors, driven into the rock near the nodes. They neutralized any empty gift within a radius of 100 meters. They could be extracted, physically, dug up and destroyed. He sent teams to 17 damaged nodes. Each team carried instructions. Find the rods, remove them, destroy them, activate the node. A month later, the reports came in. 14 of the 17 nodes had been restored. 3 remained problematic. 1 was underwater. Another was beneath the royal palace of Valengard. The third was on the territory of the Dracorn Empire. Sun A solved the problem with the third one. She wrote a letter, not to the emperor, but to her former mentor in intelligence, the woman who had once taught her how to make kimchi jjigae, the woman who was, in fact, her grandmother. The letter was long and personal. Sun A spent 3 days writing it. Then she sent it. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived. The node on Dracorn territory would be activated, no questions asked. Her grandmother wrote that she was proud of her, and that she had already tried the kimchi jjigae recipe Sun A had sent in her previous letter. Too much pepper, but tasty. Sun A read the letter and laughed. It was the first time Ethan had ever heard her laugh. For real. Without bitterness. Without a guard up. She was just laughing. Valencourt took charge of the node beneath Valengard Palace, personally. He found the suppressor in the Academy's basement. He retrieved it at night, alone, with no witnesses. When the guards asked what he was doing in the basement at 3 in the morning, he replied that he was looking for old exam papers. They believed him. He was a magister. Who would doubt a master? The node underwater remained a problem. The province of Kelmar, a flooded city. 30 meters of water above the node. Ethan thought about it for 3 days. Then he found a solution. Lighten the water. Not all of it, just the layer above the node. Make it so light that it would rise to the surface, like a bubble. It freed the node for a few minutes, long enough to activate it. This required someone to be there, someone with a strong gift. Ethan went alone. Mira said no. Ethan said there was no one else. He was the only one whose gift was strong enough for something on this scale. Mira said that if he died, everything would collapse. Ethan replied that if he didn't go, everything would drown. It was a matter of timing. Mira looked at him. Then she said she was going with him. He said it wasn't necessary. She said she wasn't asking for permission. They went down together. They walked 100 kilometers to the ruins of Kelmar, a dead city underwater. The roofs of the houses jutted out of the murky surface like tombstones. Ethan stood on the shore. He placed his hands on the water. And he pulled. It was like lifting the ocean. Not all of it. A piece of it. A column of water 20 meters in diameter and 30 meters deep. Thousands of metric tons. He wasn't making the water lighter. He was changing its vector, forcing it to move upward, away from the knot. The water rose in a column, like an upside-down waterfall. The bottom was exposed. Mud, rocks, and a metal plate from the short, exactly the same as in the Kagri mine. Mira rushed down, over the slippery rocks, through the mud. She fell, got up, ran the rest of the way, activated the beacon, a signal fire that told the hub operator on shore that the point was open. The operator was an 18-year-old boy, a former beggar from Kelmar. His gift allowed him to sense water pressure. It was useless until it became necessary to know exactly when the water column would start falling back. He shouted that the pressure was rising, that they had 30 seconds. Mira drove the anchor plate into the node's socket. She struck it with her fist. The plate clicked into place. The boy activated it. Light ran along the engraved lines. The node came to life. Mira ran upstairs. Ethan held back the water. His hands were shaking. Blood began to flow from his nose. Mira made it to the shore. Ethan let go. The column of water crashed back down with a roar that could be heard 10 kilometers away. Ethan fell to his knees. Mira sat down beside him. They sat on the shore of the dead city and breathed. Heavily. Hoarsely. Then Mira said he had a nosebleed. Ethan said he knew. Mira took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. Gently. The way you wipe the face of someone who matters. 120 out of 120. All nodes activated. The network is ready. Ethan returned to Airholm. He gathered everyone. Not the council. Everyone. 1,400 people stood on platforms and bridges, listening. Ethan stood in the center. Next to him were Mira, Lyra, Noelle, Son-A, Junho, Hana, Borg, Gareth, Arthur, Dorn, Ren, and Little Min. Everyone. Ethan said that tomorrow they would lift the continent, that 120 nodes across all of Airdalia would be activated simultaneously, that 470 bearers of the empty gifts would take their positions, that each of them was an anchor, that together they formed a network, that the network would lift the land, that the land, which had been sinking for 300 years, would finally stop sinking. He fell silent. Then he said he didn't know if it would work, that the calculations said yes, that Lyra had checked every number, that Arthur had checked every design, that Hana had recorded every step, but that no one had ever done this before, and that there were no guarantees. Silence. Then Gareth, who was standing in the third row, said that a year ago there were no guarantees either, and the bridge is still standing, and the city is flying, and he himself is alive, even though he'd promised to come for Ethan from the afterlife if anything happened. People laughed. Gareth didn't smile. He wasn't joking. But the laughter broke the tension. Morning. Dawn. The last dawn before the operation. Ethan stood at the edge of the platform. He looked at the horizon. The sky was growing lighter. The clouds were turning pink. Somewhere far below, the world was waking up, unaware that today it would change forever. Mira stood beside him, silently. They stood and watched the sunrise. Then Mira said that no matter what happened today, she wanted him to know one thing. That before him, Kagra was a place where people died, and after him, Kagra became a place where people live, and that this was enough, even if the continent didn't rise. Ethan looked at her weather-beaten face, at her tired eyes, which had grown slightly less weary over the past 3 years, at her calloused hands, at the woman who had carried the world on her shoulders for 7 years and had finally allowed someone to help. He said she had built this city, not him. He'd only drawn the blueprints. But she was the one who made sure people worked according to those blueprints, and that after work, they had a place to go, a place to eat, and a place to sleep. And that without her, he would have been just a crazy engineer who talks to rocks. Mira smiled slightly. For the first time in 3 years, he saw a real smile on her face. Not a smirk. Not a twitch of the corner of her mouth. A smile. It was time. Ethan stood in the center of the platform. His hands rested on the central anchor, the very steel disc that Borg had forged 2 years ago, the heart of Airholm. But now this disc was not just the city's anchor. It was a network node, one of 120, connected to all the others. Ethan closed his eyes. He stretched, not to the city's 800 anchors, further, deeper, to the 120 nodes, scattered across the continent, from the western coast to the eastern mountains, from the northern forests to the southern deserts. Every node responded, faintly, from far away, but they responded. 470 voices, 470 people whom the world had deemed useless. They stood at their posts, hands on the anchors, eyes closed, waiting for the signal. Ethan gave the signal, not with sound, not with light, through the network. The pulse traveled from node to node, like a wave across water. From Airholm to the east and west, to the north and south, to the farthest reaches. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Each node flashed, one after another, like stars lighting up at dawn in reverse. The network came to life. For the first time in 300 years, the earth trembled. Not on the surface, beneath, deep down, at the very foundation of the continent, as if something enormous and dormant had turned over in its sleep. The cracks that had been growing for 300 years froze. The subsidence stopped. For a moment, the entire continent froze, balancing on the edge, between falling and rising, between the past and the future. Ethan was pulling. 470 people were pulling alongside him, each at their own node, each with their own useless gift, each with a brand on their wrist. The earth began to rise, slowly, by a centimeter, by 2, by 10. The cracks closed. The water in the flooded provinces began to recede. The foundations stopped sinking. The royal palace leveled out. The temple of the first flame stopped creaking. In Valengard, people ran out into the streets. They watched their step. The earth was moving, rising, as if the continent were breathing, for the first time in 300 years. Renard Valancourt stood on the Academy's balcony. He looked down, then upward, then at his hands. At the palm where a fire had once burned, a fire he had considered the highest gift. The fire was extinguished, and for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a loss. Ethan held on. His body was burning. Blood was flowing from his nose, from his ears. His consciousness was drifting. 470 voices in his head were at their limit. Each was pulling at its own piece of the sky. Each was holding onto its own patch of earth. Mira stood beside him. She held his shoulder. She kept him from falling. Noelle stood on the other side. Her hands were on his back. Warm light poured into his body. It didn't heal. It sustained him. It gave him another minute. Then another. Sana dampened the vibrations in the platform. Lyra was counting. She shouted out the numbers. The ascent was stable. 2 meters. 5. 10. Roll. 0. The settlement was uniform across all 120 nodes. Junho stood at the perimeter, firmly, unbendable. Her gift kept her on her feet as the ground shook beneath her. Hana was taking notes. Of course she was. The date, the time, the temperature, the ascent speed, the number of active nodes. Her pen flew across the paper. History was being written right now, and she was recording it. Arthur went and stood at the edge of the platform. He looked down. His blueprints, his madness, his 20 years of solitude. All of it was now lifting an entire world. He wasn't crying. He was smiling. Quietly, calmly, like a man who had finally waited long enough. The continent had risen 20 meters, enough to stop the flooding, enough to seal the cracks, enough to give this world another 100 years, maybe 200, maybe more. Ethan secured the network. The anchors switched to autonomous mode. 470 nodes closed into a self-sustaining loop. The network would run on its own, as long as the nodes remained intact, as long as the carriers were alive, as long as the knowledge wasn't lost again. He took his hands off the anchor, opened his eyes, looked at the clouds, then down, then at the people around him, at Mira, who was holding his shoulder, at Noelle, whose hands were still glowing, at Lyra, with chalk in her pale fingers, at Sunne, who was standing by the southern node and, for the first time, wasn't hiding her smile, at Junho, who stood as steady as a rock, a single tear streaming down her cheek, at Hana, who looked up from her notebook and gazed at him, at little Min, who sat in his mother's arms, not understanding a thing, but smiling because everyone around him was smiling. Ethan said quietly, "Day 1. The continent is stable. The subsidence has stopped. The network is operating in standalone mode. We're starting to design the node maintenance system." Then he paused and added, "There are no useless skills. There are only skills for which the right task hasn't been invented yet. We've invented it." He didn't faint. Not this time. He just sat down on a rock. It was hard. Slowly. Like a man who had been carrying the world on his shoulders and had finally set it down. Mira sat down next to him. Noelle sat down next to him. One by one the others approached. Lyra, Sunne, Junho, Hana. They were sitting on Airholm's central platform. 1,400 people surrounded them. Clouds hung below their feet, the sun overhead, and the earth, which was no longer falling. Hana opened a blank page in her notebook. She wrote the title, The History of Airholm, Volume 2. She looked at Ethan. He nodded. She began to write.